The true origins of Pelinal Whitestake remain one of the most contentious subjects among imperial scholars and theologians. The Song of Pelinal, our primary source on this enigmatic figure, presents numerous contradictions and temporal inconsistencies that have fueled centuries of debate. These texts, compiled during the early First Era but describing events from the late Merethic era, contain passages that were suspiciously excised by Alessian scribes, leaving us with an incomplete picture. According to the most widely accepted accounts, Pelinal arrived in the Need-Aelid conflict seemingly from nowhere, appearing at the Aelid White Gold Tower, arrayed in armor from the future time. This peculiar description immediately sets Pelinal apart from conventional historical figures. The texts describe him descending upon the Aelid-controlled Cyrodiil, his arrival heralded by a bolt of lightning that split the sky, a detail that has led many to connect him with the goddess Kine, the Nordic deity associated with storms and widow to shore. The Kine connection runs deeper than mere symbolism. Several Nordic oral traditions maintain that Pelinal was directly sent by Kine herself as an answer to Alessia's prayers. These accounts depict Kine breathing onto the land of Cyrodiil, her divine breath materializing as the warrior Pelinal, fully formed and armored in gleaming white. This narrative aligns with Nordic religious perspectives, which view Kine as an active, interventionist deity who directly aids mortals in their struggles against elven dominance. The Nords of the First Era would have found this explanation satisfying, as it reinforced their belief in the direct involvement of their pantheon in mortal affairs. However, imperial scholars have long questioned this overtly mythic origin. The College of Whispers has proposed alternative theories, suggesting that Pelinal may have been an exceptionally gifted Nedic warrior whose deeds were posthumously mythologized. Yet this rationalist approach fails to account for the numerous supernatural elements consistently described in various accounts of Pelinal's campaigns, including his apparent immortality until his final dismemberment at the hands of Eumeral's lieutenants. Perhaps the most intriguing descriptor applied to Pelinal is that of the Star-Made Knight. This enigmatic title appears multiple times in the Song of Pelinal, yet its precise meaning remains elusive. Some scholars of Edric mythology interpret this as evidence that Pelinal originated from among the Magna G, the star spirits who followed Magnus when he fled Mundus during its creation. These entities, neither fully divine nor mortal, exist in a liminal state that might explain Pelinal's otherworldly nature and tremendous power. The star-made designation could alternatively indicate a connection to Aetherius itself, the immortal plane from which magic flows into Mundus. If Pelinal was indeed crafted from the very substance of stars, this would explain his resistance to conventional harm and his ability to channel devastating power against his Aelid enemies. Records describe his left hand glowing with a terrible light that could unmake the laws of nature, a power reminiscent of the raw creatia of Aetherius rather than conventional magicka. Theological texts from the University of Guilem Press suggest that Star-Made might be a metaphorical reference to Pelinal being forged by divine will for a specific purpose, the liberation of human slaves from Aelid tyranny. This interpretation views Pelinal not as a creation of stars in the literal sense, but as a weapon crafted by divine forces to fulfill a cosmic role in the struggle between men and Mer. The most controversial theory regarding Pelinal's origins, one that gained significant traction during the late Third Era, is that he was a Shezarene, a mortal incarnation of the missing god Lorcan, also known as Shezar in the Cyrodiilic pantheon. This theory draws upon several compelling pieces of evidence. Firstly, Pelinal's berserker rages, during which he would become the Pelinal who whitestaked his enemies, bear striking resemblance to the destructive aspects attributed to Lorcan/Shezar. These episodes of uncontrollable violence, during which Pelinal would slaughter indiscriminately, reflect the chaotic, space-taking nature of Lorcan as described in various elven mythologies. Furthermore, Pelinal's adamant hatred of elves aligns with the cosmic conflict between Lorcan and the elven ancestors. The elves have traditionally viewed Lorcan as a trickster deity who trapped their divine ancestors in mortal forms by creating Mundus. If Pelinal were indeed an aspect of Lorcan, his relentless campaign against the Aelids would represent a continuation of this primordial struggle. The texts themselves offer tantalizing hints of this connection. In one surviving fragment, Pelinal is described as surrounded by his red rage, that shape that no one can observe without seeing the spilled blood of the Aedra. This imagery evokes the heart of Lorcan, torn from his chest by Trinimac and shot across Tamriel by Auriel. When Morihaus, Alessia's demigod companion, tentatively asks Pelinal about being a Shezarene, the text abruptly ends with text lost, one of the most conspicuous redactions in the entire song. The Alessian Order, which rose to prominence after the Slave Rebellion, had complex and evolving views on Shezar. While initially revering him as the god who aided humanity, later Alessian doctrine became increasingly anti-Elven and monotheistic, eventually diminishing Shezar's role. This shifting theological landscape may explain why references to Pelinal's potential identity as a Shezarene were systematically removed from historical records. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for Pelinal's otherworldly origins comes from the temporal anomalies that surround his appearance in history. Throughout the Song of Pelinal, he makes references to people, places, and concepts that would not exist until centuries or even millennia later. He spoke of Reman, a figure who would not be born until the late First Era, approximately 1,700 years after Pelinal's death. He referred to the Red Diamond, widely understood to be the amulet of kings, before it had taken that particular form and name in imperial mythology. Most puzzlingly, Pelinal referred to Cyrodiil as Sirad, and spoke of it as an empire long before the First Empire was established under Alessia. These anachronistic references have led some scholars at the Arcane University to propose that Pelinal existed outside of conventional time, perhaps as an entity sent back from the future, or as a being who experienced time non-linearly, perceiving past, present, and future simultaneously. The White Gold Tower itself, the Aelid structure at the heart of the imperial city, is known to have unique properties related to time and reality due to its status as an Ada Mancha tower. Some theoretical texts suggest that Pelinal's proximity to the tower throughout the rebellion may have caused temporal distortions in his perception and speech, leading to these prophetic utterances. Another possibility is that Pelinal was not merely a warrior, but a form of divine intervention similar to an avatar or aspect of an Edric force. The 8 divines, having largely surrendered their agency by participating in the creation of Mundus, rarely intervene directly in mortal affairs. However, historical precedents exist for limited divine manifestations during times of exceptional need. If Pelinal represented such a manifestation, perhaps of Shezar himself, his awareness might have transcended normal temporal constraints. Pelinal's armor presents another enigma. Described as made from a compound of lunar silver and star iron, it possessed properties unknown to First-Era metallurgy. Some accounts claim it would instantly repair itself when damaged, while others suggest it was impervious to all but the most powerful Aelid magics. The technological sophistication implied by these descriptions further supports the theory that Pelinal originated from outside the conventional timeline, perhaps from a future era or an alternate reality altogether. The Thalmor archives in Alinor contain their own interpretations of Pelinal's origins, though these documents remain largely inaccessible to imperial scholars. Fragmentary reports suggest that Aldmeri tradition views Pelinal as a particularly virulent manifestation of Lorcan's disruptive influence, a time wound made flesh sent to derail Elven ascension. While obviously biased against Pelinal, these Aldmeri accounts nonetheless acknowledge his extranatural origins. Archaeological expeditions to sites of Pelinal's major battles have yielded curious findings that add to the mystery. At the ruins of Sard and Macamentane, 2 Aelid cities Pelinal destroyed utterly, researchers from the Synod discovered stone fragments that had been transmuted at the molecular level, a phenomenon requiring magical energies far beyond what even the most powerful battle mages of the current era can produce. These findings suggest that whatever power Pelinal wielded, it operated on principles fundamentally different from conventional magic. The question of Pelinal's true nature, whether divine agent, time-displaced warrior, Shezarene, or something else entirely, remains unresolved. What seems clear from all accounts is that he represented a force beyond the ordinary, a being whose very existence challenged the established order of Cyrodiil during the late Merethic era. His origins, shrouded in mystery and contradiction, may never be fully understood, as the truth likely lies somewhere between historical fact and mythic symbolism, in that liminal space where Tamrilic history so often resides. When Pelinal Whitestake first appeared in Cyrodiil, the Aelid dominion was at the height of its cruelty. Human slaves toiled under conditions of unimaginable brutality. The Aelids, practicing what scholars now refer to as flesh sculpture, used their subjects for magical experiments and sadistic entertainment. Nedic captives were forced to construct the White Gold Tower and its surrounding city while suffering torments designed to break not just their bodies but their spirits. It was into this darkness that Pelinal arrived. The exact location of his first appearance remains disputed in historical accounts, though most credible sources place it near Lake Rumer. Covered in blood not his own, he approached the hidden camp where Alessia had gathered her most trusted followers. According to the fragmented texts of the Song of Pelinal, he came like a storm, covered in malachite armor that reflected none of the campfire light yet caught all of the stars above. Alessia, already recognized as a spiritual leader among the Needs for her visions of Akatosh, initially approached the blood-drenched warrior with caution. The meeting between these two pivotal figures occurred during a moonless night when Alessia had retreated to pray for divine intervention. Witnesses described how Pelinal knelt before her, not as a subject to a queen, but as one who recognized a kindred purpose. He spoke of having heard her prayers across the currents of time and pledged his sword to her cause. What followed was not immediate action, but strategic preparation. Contrary to popular depictions that portray Pelinal as solely a berserker force, historical records indicate that he spent several months working with Alessia to organize the scattered resistance movements. Alessia had already established a network of informants and sympathizers throughout Cyrodiil, but lacked the military expertise to transform these disparate groups into a cohesive fighting force. Pelinal brought not just his own martial prowess, but tactical knowledge that seemed to transcend the military understanding of the era. He introduced concepts of formation, fighting to the former slaves, teaching them to use their numbers effectively against the magically superior Aelids. The rebellion's early training grounds, recently excavated near modern Skingrad, reveal practice areas where Pelinal taught fighters to use simple shields in overlapping patterns, a technique that would prove devastatingly effective against Aelid spellcasters who relied on direct magical attacks. The alliance between Pelinal, Alessia, and Morihaus, who arrived shortly after Pelinal, created a leadership triad that balanced spiritual authority, tactical brilliance, and raw power. Alessia provided the vision and legitimacy that united the diverse human populations of Cyrodiil. Morihaus, the half-man, half-bull son of Kine, contributed immense strength and the ability to counter Aelid weather magic. Pelinal, meanwhile, served as the rebellion's master strategist and most fearsome warrior. The division of responsibilities among this triumvirate proved crucial to the rebellion's success. Alessia focused on building political alliances, even securing support from certain Aelid lords who had grown disillusioned with the excessive cruelty of their kin. Morihaus led direct assaults on Aelid strongholds, his physical might allowing rebels to breach fortifications previously thought impenetrable. Pelinal, although often remembered primarily for his berserker rages, actually spent much of his time moving between scattered rebel groups, training fighters, and coordinating simultaneous strikes against multiple targets. The first major engagement of the rebellion occurred at the Aelid settlement of Sard, located in what is now the Great Forest region. Prior to the attack, Pelinal infiltrated the city alone, systematically eliminating sentries and sabotaging the magical wards that protected the settlement. When the main rebel force arrived, led by Morihaus, they found the city's defenses already compromised. The Battle of Sard, as it came to be known, ended with the complete destruction of the Aelid presence there and the liberation of over 3,000 human slaves. What made this victory particularly significant was not just its military success, but its psychological impact. The Aelids had maintained control partly through cultivating a belief in their invincibility. The fall of Sard shattered this perception and sparked uprisings throughout the surrounding regions. Newly freed slaves, rather than fleeing, overwhelmingly chose to join Alessia's forces, swelling the rebellion's ranks. Pelinal's tactical approach during this early phase revealed a sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare. Rather than engaging the numerically and magically superior Aelid forces directly, he advocated targeted strikes against supply lines and isolated outposts. The rebellion systematically liberated slave quarters and work camps, incorporating the freed captives into their growing army while denying the Aelids their labor force. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals another aspect of Pelinal's strategy: the deliberate targeting of Aelid Welkind and Varla stones. These crystalline objects, which stored magical energy and powered Aelid enchantments, represented both a military and economic resource for the Elven overlords. By destroying or capturing these stones, the rebellion effectively diminished the Aelids' magical advantage while simultaneously crippling their economy. The Battle of Vahtesen marked another crucial turning point engineered by Pelinal. Located in the eastern reaches of Cyrodiil, Vahtesen served as a major administrative center where Aelid mage lords conducted their most horrific experiments on human subjects. Rather than a frontal assault, Pelinal led a small team of former slaves who knew the city's underground passages. They infiltrated the settlement during a ritual ceremony when most of the Aelid leadership was gathered in a central chamber. Historical accounts describe what happened next with a mixture of awe and horror. Pelinal, upon breaking into the ceremonial hall, underwent one of his first documented red rages. Witnesses reported that his armor began to glow with an internal light that burned like the sun reflected on silver, and he moved with such speed that observers could track his position only by the trail of dismembered Aelid bodies he left behind. By the time Morihaus arrived with the main force, Pelinal had single-handedly slaughtered the entire ruling council of Vahtesen. The remaining Aelid soldiers, leaderless and demoralized, offered minimal resistance. What made this victory particularly significant was the recovery of ancient texts and magical artifacts that had been hoarded by the Vahtesen mage lords. These resources provided the rebellion with crucial knowledge about Aelid weaknesses and magical countermeasures. Following Vahtesen, Pelinal's approach shifted from guerrilla tactics to more direct confrontations. This change reflected the growing strength of the rebel forces and the increasingly desperate position of the Aelids. The rebellion began targeting major population centers, with Pelinal often leading advance forces to breach defenses ahead of the main army. The Battle of Macamentain exemplified this new phase of the conflict. Unlike earlier engagements, this was a direct siege against a heavily fortified Aelid city. Pelinal's innovative use of captured Aelid magical artifacts allowed the human forces to counter the defensive enchantments that had previously made such strongholds impregnable. Historical records describe how Pelinal used a captured Varla stone to temporarily neutralize the magical barriers surrounding the city, creating a window of opportunity for Morihaus to lead a direct assault on the main gate. What followed was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire rebellion. The fighting lasted 3 days, with Pelinal reportedly remaining at the front lines without rest for the entire duration. When Aelid reinforcements arrived from nearby settlements, Pelinal led a sortie that caught them in an expertly executed pincer movement. The maneuver displayed a level of tactical sophistication that many scholars believe would not be seen again in Cyrodiil until the rise of Reman one nearly 2 millennia later. The aftermath of Macamentain revealed both the strategic brilliance and the troubling nature of Pelinal's leadership. While the victory secured control of a crucial region and freed thousands of slaves, it also demonstrated the extreme brutality that characterized Pelinal's campaigns. Unlike Alessia, who generally showed mercy to surrendering Aelids, Pelinal pursued a policy of total extermination. The texts describe how he ordered the complete destruction of Macamentain, leaving not one stone upon another, nor any living thing that bore the blood of the Aelids. This approach created tension within the rebellion's leadership. Historical records preserved in the Imperial Library contain evidence of heated disagreements between Alessia and Pelinal regarding the treatment of captured Aelids and those who surrendered. While Alessia advocated for incorporating cooperative Aelid lords into her emerging political structure, Pelinal viewed all elves as enemies to be eliminated. Morihaus often served as mediator between these conflicting viewpoints, though his own sympathies typically aligned more closely with Pelinal's uncompromising stance. Despite these internal conflicts, the rebellion maintained its momentum. By the end of its first year, approximately one-third of Cyrodiil had been liberated from Aelid control. The pattern of victories established during this period would continue, with Pelinal's military genius and supernatural combat abilities complementing Alessia's political acumen and Morihouse's raw power. The Battle of Ninendava demonstrated how this combination of talents could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Ninendava was an Aelid stronghold built into the side of a mountain in what is now the Coluvian Highlands. Its elevated position and natural defenses made direct assault nearly impossible. Rather than attempt a conventional siege, Pelinal devised a multi-layered strategy that exemplified his innovative approach to warfare. First, rebel agents infiltrated the settlement's water supply, not to poison it, but to introduce a harmless substance that replicated the effects of altitude sickness. As the Aelid defenders began experiencing disorientation and weakness, Pelinal led a small force up a seemingly impassable cliff face on the settlement's eastern side. They used specialized climbing tools that Pelinal himself had designed, another example of his anachronistic knowledge. Once inside, this advance team disabled the magical defenses that would have detected the main rebel army approaching from the west. When Morihouse led the frontal assault, the Aelids found themselves fighting on two fronts while suffering from the debilitating effects of the contaminated water. The settlement fell within hours, with minimal casualties among the rebel forces. The victory at Ninendava yielded not just territorial gains, but critical intelligence. Among the captured materials were detailed maps of the remaining Aelid strongholds throughout Cyrodiil, including information about their defenses and supply routes. This intelligence allowed Alessia and Pelinal to coordinate simultaneous attacks against multiple targets, preventing the Aelids from concentrating their forces effectively. As the rebellion gained momentum, Pelinal's reputation grew to mythic proportions among both his followers and his enemies. Human fighters viewed him with a mixture of awe and fear, while Aelid accounts described him as a terror beyond understanding and the white snake of human vengeance. This reputation itself became a weapon, with some Aelid settlements surrendering immediately upon learning that Pelinal was approaching their walls. The psychological impact of Pelinal's campaign extended beyond immediate tactical advantages. By systematically destroying Aelid cultural and religious sites, he undermined the foundation of their society. The White Gold Tower, while still under Aelid control, stood increasingly isolated as the surrounding territories fell to the rebellion. This isolation forced the remaining Aelid leadership to concentrate their forces around the capital, abandoning outlying settlements and creating opportunities for further rebel advances. By the midpoint of the rebellion, Pelinal had developed a cadre of human officers trained in his distinctive fighting style and tactical approach. These individuals, known as the Whitestake Shields, led independent operations throughout Cyrodiil, effectively multiplying Pelinal's influence beyond his physical presence. Archaeological evidence from battle sites associated with these officers reveals consistent patterns of engagement that bear Pelinal's tactical signature: rapid strikes against command structures followed by controlled withdrawal before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Pelinal Whitestake's martial presence on the battlefield was made unmistakable by his distinctive armor, a sight that came to symbolize both liberation and terror across Cyrodiil. Unlike the typical leather and bronze combinations favored by Nedic warriors of the era, Pelinal's armor represented something entirely different, a technological and mystical marvel that defied the metallurgical understanding of the First Era. The most striking feature of his armor was its coloration. Described in the Song of Pelinal as gleaming white as star-touched snow, the armor possessed a luminous quality that made Pelinal visible even in the darkest night battles. This brilliant white appearance wasn't merely aesthetic, but served practical purposes during the rebellion. Freed slaves could easily identify their champion amidst the chaos of battle, while Aelid forces learned to fear the approaching white figure cutting through their ranks. What made this armor truly remarkable was its composition. Multiple accounts describe it as made from the enemy's silver, a reference not to stolen Aelid materials, but to something far more significant. Aelid society placed tremendous value on lunar symbolism, with silver representing their connection to the moons and the magical properties they derived from these celestial bodies. By wearing armor fashioned from the enemy's silver, Pelinal symbolically appropriated the very source of Aelid magical power and turned it against them. The actual material of the armor appears to have been a unique alloy combining lunar silver with what ancient texts call star iron, likely meteoric metal, which has always held special significance in Tamrelic metallurgy. This combination created a material with exceptional properties. Imperial archival records from the University of Gwylem describe how the armor turned aside both blade and spell, suggesting enchantment capabilities far beyond First-era crafting techniques. Most remarkable was the armor's apparent ability to repair itself. Eyewitness accounts claim that wounds inflicted upon the armor would close like flesh healing, but in the span of moments rather than days. This self-restoration property has led some scholars to suggest the armor wasn't merely enchanted, but somehow alive or connected to Pelinal in a symbiotic relationship. The Arcane University's Department of Theoretical Artificery has proposed that the armor might have been a form of bound Daedric entity, though this theory remains highly controversial among Imperial theologians. The armor consisted of several distinct components, each with apparent magical properties. The breastplate bore an insignia that contemporary accounts describe variously as a red diamond or the crystallized blood of creation, imagery that bears striking similarity to later descriptions of the Amulet of Kings. This emblem would glow with increasing intensity during Pelinal's berserker episodes, suggesting a connection to his emotional or spiritual state. The gauntlets deserve special mention, particularly the left one. Multiple sources describe Pelinal's left hand as occasionally emanating a terrible light, capable of unmaking matter itself. During the siege of Seatatar, Pelinal reportedly placed this gauntleted hand against the city's enchanted gates, causing the metal to flow like water before collapsing entirely. This ability to negate the fundamental properties of materials suggests magic operating on principles entirely different from the established schools of the First Era. The helmet, described as faceless and smooth as a mirror, concealed Pelinal's features entirely. This design choice carried powerful psychological impact in battle. Without visible facial expressions, Pelinal became something other than human to both allies and enemies, a force of nature rather than a man. The reflective quality of the helmet's surface also served a practical purpose against Aelid light magic, turning their favored spells back upon the casters. The symbolic importance of Pelinal's white armor extended beyond battlefield recognition. In Aelid culture, darkness represented sophistication and spiritual elevation. Their architecture emphasized shadows and subtle illumination, while their magic often manipulated light to create darkness. The Aelids viewed light magic as crude and unsophisticated compared to their shadow-based spellcraft. By appearing in blindingly white armor, Pelinal presented a direct ideological challenge to Aelid aesthetic and magical principles. This symbolic opposition manifested most dramatically during night battles. Aelid warriors typically used darkness as tactical cover, but Pelinal's armor nullified this advantage. According to accounts from the Battle of Vatesin, his armor carried its own light, like moonlight captured in metal, making him visible to his forces while simultaneously revealing hidden Aelid positions. This characteristic transformed the armor from mere protection into a strategic asset that altered the dynamics of nighttime engagements. Complementing his legendary armor was Pelinal's arsenal of weapons, foremost among them his sword. Unlike the curved bronze blades common among Nedic forces, Pelinal wielded what the song describes as a blade straight and terrible as daylight. Metallurgical analysis of fragments purportedly from this weapon, preserved in the Imperial Palace, indicates a steel alloy of quality unattainable in the First Era, containing trace elements suggesting extraterrestrial origin. The sword possessed unique properties against magical defenses. Aelid battle mages typically surrounded themselves with protective wards that could deflect conventional weapons. Pelinal's blade, however, cut through these magical barriers as a knife through fog. This ability proved decisive in direct confrontations with Aelid leadership, who relied heavily on magical protection rather than physical armor. Inscriptions ran along the blade in a script that defied translation by First-era scholars. Modern linguistic analysis by the Synod has identified similarities to Ailnofex, the language of the Dawn era, though with significant deviations, suggesting either a regional variant or a later evolutionary stage of the language. These inscriptions reportedly glowed blue when in proximity to magic, serving as both warning and targeting system during combat with spellcasters. The sword's hilt deserves particular attention. Crafted from a material described as neither metal nor stone, it bore an 8-pointed star motif that some scholars connect to the constellation of the warrior. This celestial symbolism reinforced Pelinal's connection to the heavens and possibly to Edric forces. The hilt also contained a reservoir of magical energy that supplemented the blade's enchantments, allowing for sustained effectiveness against multiple magical opponents without degradation. In addition to his primary sword, Pelinal occasionally wielded a mace during siege operations. This weapon, significantly heavier than conventional maces of the era, could shatter stone fortifications with single blows. During the assault on Sard, Pelinal reportedly breached the city's main gate with 3 strikes of this weapon, despite the gate being reinforced with both physical and magical barriers. The mace head was described as crystalline yet unbreakable, suggesting a material unknown to First-era crafting traditions. Pelinal's combat style reflected both superhuman ability and sophisticated tactical understanding. Unlike the berserker approach often attributed to him in popular culture, contemporary accounts describe a fighter of extraordinary precision and economy of movement. The Song of Pelinal notes that he moved like water between stones, finding gaps where none appeared to exist. This fluidity of motion allowed him to engage multiple opponents simultaneously, a critical advantage when facing numerically superior Aelid forces. His fighting technique incorporated elements that would not become common in Cyrodiilic martial traditions for centuries. He utilized counterbalance principles and momentum redirection that Imperial legionnaires would later adopt during the Remand dynasty. This anachronistic knowledge further supports theories of his otherworldly origins, as such techniques had no known precedent in First-era combat styles. Particularly noteworthy was Pelinal's approach to magical opponents. Rather than attempting to resist or deflect spells, the standard tactic taught to warriors facing mages, he would close distance with supernatural speed, entering what combat theorists now call the dead zone, where spellcasting becomes impractical. This technique proved devastatingly effective against Aelid battle mages, who typically maintained distance from physical combatants. During the Battle of Celadil, Pelinal demonstrated this approach against an Aelid sorcerer king named Haramir of Copper and Tea. As Haramir began casting a complex destruction spell, Pelinal crossed the intervening space between one heartbeat and the next, severing the mage's casting arm before the spell could be completed. This ability to interrupt magical rituals made him particularly feared among Aelid spellcasters, who began incorporating physical barriers into their defensive strategies specifically to counter his techniques. Pelinal's combat effectiveness extended beyond individual engagements to larger tactical applications. He pioneered formation fighting techniques that maximized the effectiveness of freed slaves with minimal training. These formations, which Imperial military historians now recognize as precursors to the Testudo and Cunnius formations of later legions, allowed relatively inexperienced fighters to counter superior Aelid magic through coordinated movement and shield positioning. The Whitestake wedge, as it came to be known, involved fighters arranging themselves in a triangular formation, with shields overlapping both laterally and vertically. This created a mobile defensive structure that could advance against magical barrages while maintaining cohesion. Pelinal typically positioned himself at the tip of this formation, using his armor's resistance to magic to absorb the initial brunt of enemy spells before the formation engaged in close combat. During his infamous Red Moments, Pelinal's fighting style transformed dramatically. These episodes, triggered by extreme rage or the death of close companions, saw him abandon tactical discipline in favor of overwhelming aggression. Contemporary accounts describe these transformations in almost metaphysical terms. His armor would pulse with crimson light, his movements would become blindingly fast, and he would cut through Aeolid ranks like a storm of blades. The aftermath of these episodes often featured disturbing tableaus of destruction. Following his rage at the Battle of Celadil, witnesses described bodies, dismembered with such precision that they remained standing for moments before collapsing. This surgical violence, even in the midst of berserker fury, suggests that Pelinal retained some level of technical skill even when overcome by bloodlust. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts of Pelinal's martial prowess. Excavations at confirmed battle sites reveal distinctive damage patterns on recovered Aeolid armor, clean, precise cuts through enchanted elven metal that metallurgists confirm would require force beyond human capability. Skeletal remains show evidence of wounds delivered with such speed that bones on opposite sides of the body were severed before the initial impact could displace the target. The effectiveness of Pelinal's combat approach extended beyond his personal engagements. He systematically trained cadres of human fighters in simplified versions of his techniques, creating the first organized human military units in Cyrodiilic history. These fighters, while unable to replicate his supernatural abilities, adopted his tactical principles and equipment configurations. The distinctive white shields carried by these units became a hallmark of the rebellion's elite forces. Pelinal's weaponry, like his armor, possessed origins shrouded in mystery. The Song of Pelinal offers contradictory accounts, variously claiming his weapons were gifted by the gods, forged from the last breath of a dying star, or carried with him from another Kalpa. These poetic descriptions likely reflect attempts to explain the weapon's clearly supernatural properties through mythological frameworks familiar to First-Era chroniclers. Material analysis of weapon fragments allegedly from Pelinal's arsenal, preserved in the Imperial City, has yielded puzzling results. The metal contains isotopic ratios inconsistent with any known Tamrelic ore deposits, leading some scholars to propose extraterrestrial origins. Others suggest the unusual composition resulted from forging methods involving extreme magical manipulation of conventional materials, though such techniques would have been unknown during the First Era. The enchantments on Pelinal's weapons displayed unusual permanence. While conventional enchanted weapons of the era required regular recharging through soul gems or similar magical sources, Pelinal's arsenal maintained consistent magical properties throughout the rebellion. This self-sustaining enchantment suggests either an internal power source or a connection to a persistent external source of magical energy. The duality of Pelinal Whitestake's nature manifested most dramatically in what contemporary accounts termed his killing fits, episodes of uncontrolled rage that transformed the calculated military strategist into an instrument of indiscriminate slaughter. These berserker states represented more than mere battle fury. They constituted a fundamental aspect of his being that both aided the Alessian cause and threatened to undermine it. The earliest documented instance of Pelinal's madness occurred during the liberation of a mining camp near Lake Rumer. After witnessing particularly brutal treatment of Nedic slaves, Pelinal entered what witnesses described as a red moment. His armor began to emit a crimson glow that intensified until it appeared to observers that he was bathed in blood light. What followed was not the precise, economical combat that typically characterized his fighting style, but a whirlwind of destruction that claimed not only the Aeolid overseers, but dozens of uninvolved elven civilians who had no connection to the slave operations. Alessian chroniclers struggled to reconcile these episodes with Pelinal's otherwise methodical approach to warfare. The Song of Pelinal refers to these states as times when the Pelinal that became lost and the Pelinal that would destroy took his place. This dissociative language suggests that even his contemporaries viewed these episodes as transformative rather than merely emotional, as though another entity temporarily inhabited his form. Medical scholars from the Imperial Chirurgical Society have retrospectively analyzed these accounts, suggesting that Pelinal exhibited symptoms consistent with severe battle trauma, combined with an underlying condition affecting his cognitive regulation. However, such rationalist explanations fail to account for the supernatural elements consistently reported during these episodes, particularly the physical transformation of his armor and weapons. The theological implications of Pelinal's madness extend beyond psychological interpretation. If, as many scholars contend, Pelinal was indeed a Shezarene, a mortal incarnation of the missing god Lorcan/Shezar, then his episodes of uncontrolled violence may represent the manifestation of Lorcan's chaotic, space-taking nature breaking through a more controlled human vessel. The Alessian theologian Theoporus of Kevach proposed that these fits represented moments when the divine aspect overwhelmed its mortal container, causing a temporary reversion to a more primordial state of being. This interpretation gains credibility when examining the specific triggers for Pelinal's episodes. They frequently occurred when confronted with particular forms of Aeolid magic, especially those involving manipulation of light and shadow, practices connected to Aeolid worship of the Aedra Magnus. In Elven religious tradition, Magnus represents the opposition to Lorcan's material creation, having fled Mundus to preserve his divine essence. If Pelinal indeed carried Lorcan's essence, his violent reaction to Magnus-aligned magic would represent a continuation of this primeval conflict between competing divine visions. The physical manifestations accompanying Pelinal's madness further suggest a divine or supernatural origin. During these episodes, witnesses consistently reported that his left hand emitted a light described as terrible to behold, a light that seemed to unmake rather than illuminate. During the siege of Seatatar, Pelinal's left hand reportedly caused stone and metal to dissolve, like snow in summer heat, allowing him to breach fortifications by simply touching them. This ability to negate the fundamental properties of matter aligns with mythological accounts of Lorcan's role in creating the material world, suggesting that during his fits, Pelinal could temporarily unmake creation itself. The most infamous and thoroughly documented instance of Pelinal's madness occurred following the Battle of the Needs of Sedor. After Morihaus suffered a serious wound from Aeolid star magic, Pelinal entered a killing fit that lasted 3 days and nights. He slaughtered not only the responsible Aeolid forces, but proceeded to massacre the entire population of Sedor, including elven children, and even, according to some accounts, household pets and livestock. The destruction extended beyond living beings to the physical infrastructure of the settlement itself, with buildings reduced to rubble and the surrounding landscape altered through what witnesses described as the unmaking light emanating from his armor. When Pelinal finally emerged from this state, he reportedly had no memory of his actions. This amnesiac quality characterized all of his episodes, creating a disturbing discontinuity in his experience. In a fragment of the Song of Pelinal preserved in the Imperial Library, but omitted from most published versions, he is quoted as saying, "I wake to find blood not mine upon my hands, and cities fallen that I do not recall conquering." This lack of recall suggests that during these episodes, his consciousness was either suppressed or replaced entirely. The relationship between Pelinal's madness and his supposed divine nature becomes most apparent when examining the aftermath of his killing fits. Archaeological excavations at sites of his berserker episodes reveal anomalous magical residues unlike those found at locations of conventional battles. Studies conducted by the Synod have detected patterns of magical disruption that persist for centuries, areas where enchantments fail unpredictably and conjuration spells produce unstable results. These magical anomalies suggest that Pelinal's fits temporarily distorted the fundamental laws of reality in ways consistent with divine intervention rather than mortal magic. The theological implications of Pelinal's madness proved problematic for the early Alessian order. While they celebrated his role in liberating humanity from Aeolid oppression, his indiscriminate violence complicated efforts to portray him as a purely righteous champion. This ambivalence is reflected in the systematic redaction of certain passages from the Song of Pelinal, particularly those describing the full extent of his atrocities against non-combatants. The Alessian doctrine, which eventually evolved toward monotheism, struggled to incorporate a figure whose behavior so clearly embodied chaos rather than order. Alessia herself recognized the danger posed by Pelinal's unpredictable nature early in the rebellion. Historical records indicate that she implemented specific protocols for managing his episodes, including the designation of trusted officers tasked with directing his fury toward military targets when possible and evacuating civilians when not. These handlers of the White Knight, as they came to be known, wore distinctive red sashes that reportedly helped Pelinal recognize them even in his maddened state. Morehouse played a particularly crucial role in managing Pelinal's episodes. As a demoprince with divine blood himself, Morehouse possessed both the physical strength to intervene when necessary and a spiritual connection that allowed him to reach Pelinal even in his most dissociated states. Contemporary accounts describe occasions when Morehouse physically restrained Pelinal during particularly severe episodes, suffering significant injuries in the process, but preventing greater catastrophes. The practical challenges of incorporating such an unpredictable force into military operations led to specific tactical adaptations within the Alessian forces. Before major engagements, Alessia would deploy scouts to identify and evacuate any non-combatants from the anticipated battlefield, including elven civilians who might oppose Aelid rule. Units fighting alongside Pelinal carried specialized shields designed to withstand the energy discharges that occasionally emanated from his armor during his fits, and maintained formation patterns that could quickly adapt to create distance between him and allied forces if he showed signs of losing control. These precautions proved insufficient during the massacre at Sedor, which represented a turning point in how the rebellion's leadership managed Pelinal. Following this incident, Alessia implemented more stringent controls, including having Pelinal accompanied at all times by a cadre of Nord shamans who had experience calming berserkers through a combination of alchemical preparations and ritual chanting. These measures proved partially effective, reducing the frequency and duration of his episodes, though not eliminating them entirely. The relationship between Pelinal's madness and specific triggers became a subject of careful study within Alessia's inner circle. They observed that his episodes most commonly occurred after exposure to certain forms of Aelid magic, particularly those involving manipulation of starlight. This observation led to preventative measures, including having him wear a specially enchanted amulet that disrupted the effects of such magic before it could trigger an episode. The amulet's design, preserved in Imperial archives, incorporated fragments of meteoric glass that supposedly filtered harmful magical influences. Beyond practical management, Alessia recognized the need to contextualize Pelinal's madness within a theological framework that would make it comprehensible to her followers. She developed a narrative that portrayed his fits as manifestations of divine wrath against Aelid cruelty, necessary, if terrible, expressions of cosmic justice. This interpretation gained traction among the rank and file of the rebellion, who came to view Pelinal's madness not as a liability, but as evidence of his divine mandate. This theological justification became increasingly important as the rebellion progressed and accounts of Pelinal's atrocities spread. The Aelid leadership attempted to use these incidents to rally neutral elven settlements to their cause, portraying the rebellion not as a liberation movement, but as an existential threat to all Marish peoples. Alessia countered this propaganda by contextualizing Pelinal's violence within a narrative of righteous retribution for centuries of Aelid atrocities against humans. The most theologically significant aspect of Pelinal's madness emerged in its relationship to his prophetic utterances. During his killing fits, he frequently spoke in what witnesses described as the tongue of gods, making references to people and events that would not exist for centuries. He mentioned Reman and the Red Diamond, terms that would only gain significance hundreds of years later with the rise of the Reman dynasty. These anachronistic statements, delivered while in a state of divine madness, suggested a connection to time itself that transcended normal mortal limitations. The destruction of the needs of Sedor remains the most controversial episode in accounts of Pelinal's madness. Unlike the Aelids, the needs of this particular settlement had maintained a degree of autonomy through collaboration with their elven overlords. When Pelinal discovered their role in providing intelligence to Aelid forces about rebel movements, he entered one of his most prolonged and destructive fits. The resulting massacre eliminated the entire settlement, an act that troubled even his most devoted followers. In the aftermath of Sedor, Morihaus confronted Pelinal directly about the nature of his fits. According to fragments preserved in the Alessian commentaries, but omitted from the canonical song, Morihaus asked whether these episodes represented the influence of Shezar or some other divine force. Pelinal's response was cryptic. "I am not what I was before the stars changed, nor what I shall be when the Kalpa turns. The in-between thing you see is but a shadow cast by light that has not yet reached you." This enigmatic statement suggests that Pelinal himself viewed his madness as an inevitable consequence of his liminal nature, neither fully divine nor fully mortal. The management of Pelinal's condition became increasingly sophisticated as the rebellion progressed. Alessian priests developed rituals specifically designed to bring him out of his berserker states, incorporating elements that would later evolve into formal Alessian religious practices. These ceremonies involved rhythmic chanting in Proto-Cyrodiilic, the burning of specific herbs known to calm the mind, and the presentation of symbolic objects associated with Alessia herself, whose presence consistently demonstrated a stabilizing effect on Pelinal's mental state. Pelinal Whitestrake's systematic campaign against the Aelid city-states represented not merely a series of military engagements, but a methodical dismantling of an entire civilization. The fragmentation of Aelid political power following centuries of internal conflicts created vulnerabilities that Pelinal exploited with tactical precision. Unlike the unified empire suggested by popular histories, the Aelid domains consisted of dozens of independent city-states, many of which maintained uneasy alliances or outright hostilities toward one another. The earliest phase of Pelinal's anti-Aelid crusade targeted the settlements along Lake Rumir's eastern shore. Seatatar, a major center of Aelid magical research, became his first significant objective after the liberation of smaller outposts. The city's ruling sorcerer king, Senedelin, had developed defensive enchantments that rendered conventional siege approaches ineffective. Magical barriers surrounded the city, causing any projectile or person attempting unauthorized entry to burst into flame. Pelinal approached Seatatar alone during the winter solstice of 1E242, when Aelid magical observances required the temporary lowering of defensive barriers for stellar alignment rituals. Historical accounts describe how he infiltrated the city by disguising himself as an Aelid priest, using artifacts captured from previous engagements to bypass the remaining magical wards. Once inside the central observatory, Pelinal revealed himself and engaged Senedelin in single combat. The duel between Pelinal and Senedelin exemplified the clash between human martial prowess and Aelid magical sophistication. Senedelin unleashed spells that manipulated light itself, creating blinding flashes and shadow constructs that fought as independent entities. Pelinal countered with his extraordinary speed and the magical resistance of his white armor, closing distance to prevent Senedelin from completing more complex incantations. The battle ended when Pelinal drove his sword through an apparent image of Senedelin, only to pivot and strike the real Sorcerer King, who had been projecting illusions from a different position. With Seatatar's leadership eliminated, Pelinal signaled the main Alessian forces waiting beyond the city's boundaries. The subsequent occupation of Seatatar yielded significant magical knowledge and artifacts that would prove crucial in later engagements. Most valuable among these were detailed maps of the magical conduit systems that connected major Aelid settlements, information that allowed Pelinal to target nexus points and disrupt Aelid communications across entire regions. The fall of Seatatar revealed a critical aspect of Aelid political fragmentation. Neighboring city-states, rather than rallying to defend their kindred, used the opportunity to settle old scores. The ruler of Lindai, a rival settlement that had long contested Seatatar's control of regional waterways, sent envoys to Pelinal offering tactical information about other Aelid strongholds in exchange for being spared. This pattern of Aelid rulers prioritizing ancient rivalries over the collective threat would repeatedly create openings for Pelinal's forces. Pelinal refused the diplomatic overture from Lindi, reportedly stating that no compromise exists between slavery and freedom. His rejection of potential Aelid allies differed markedly from Alessia's more pragmatic approach, creating tension within the rebellion's leadership. While Alessia sought to incorporate cooperative Aelids into her emerging political structure, Pelinal pursued a strategy of complete eradication, viewing all Aelids as inherently complicit in human enslavement. This ideological divide became most apparent during the campaign against Sedor, an Aelid settlement whose ruling family had recently converted from Daedra worship to veneration of the Aedra. The Aedra-worshipping Aelids, known as the Barsebic Aelids, had begun implementing more moderate policies toward their human subjects, even freeing some slaves as religious offerings to the divines. Alessia saw potential allies in these reformed Aelids, while Pelinal viewed their religious conversion as mere political expediency. The assault on Sedor demonstrated Pelinal's uncompromising approach. Despite evidence of improved conditions for humans within the city, he led a night attack that specifically targeted religious structures dedicated to Aedric worship. The Barsebic priests, who had expected leniency due to their shared religious values with the Alessians, were executed alongside their Daedra-worshipping counterparts. Archaeological evidence from Sedor reveals that Aedric shrines were desecrated with the same thoroughness as Daedric altars, suggesting that Pelinal made no theological distinctions in his campaign. This religious dimension of the conflict reflected deeper divisions within Aelid society. The majority of Aelid city-states practiced Daedra worship, with particular emphasis on the princes Meridia and Malag Bal. These Daedruphile Aelids viewed humans primarily as resources to be exploited, using them for labor, magical experiments, and sacrificial rituals. The minority Aedraphil faction, centered in the western regions of Cyrodiil, had adopted more moderate positions influenced by Altmeri religious traditions. Pelinal exploited this theological schism by timing his attacks to coincide with religious festivals when Daedruphile and Aedraphil Aelids would gather separately for observances. The massacre at Celidil occurred during a solar ceremony dedicated to Meridia, when the city's population had doubled due to visitors from aligned settlements. Similarly, his attack on the Aedraphil stronghold of Miskarkand took place during an Aedric calendar observance, when many of the city's warriors had departed on religious pilgrimages. The political fragmentation of Aelid society extended beyond religious differences to encompass economic rivalries and dynastic disputes. The Aelid settlement of Varsabalim had severed diplomatic relations with the neighboring city-state of Ninandava over control of regional Varla stone deposits, crystalline objects essential for advanced Aelid magic. When Pelinal's forces approached Ninandava, the rulers of Varsabalim not only refused to send aid, but actively blocked refugees seeking shelter within their walls. Pelinal's siege of Ninandava demonstrated his evolving tactical approach to Aelid magical defenses. Rather than attempting to overcome the settlement's formidable magical barriers directly, he targeted the underground aqueducts that supplied water to the city. Alessian sappers, trained by Pelinal in techniques for detecting and disrupting magical wards, infiltrated these water channels and introduced alchemical agents that neutralized the magical properties of Varla stones within the city. As Ninandava's magical defenses faltered, Pelinal led a direct assault on the main gate. The city's defenders, accustomed to relying on magical advantages rather than conventional military tactics, proved ill-prepared for the disciplined Alessian formations. The battle concluded when Pelinal confronted the city's ruler, Senarsal, in the central tower. Unlike previous engagements where he had killed Aelid leadership immediately, Pelinal captured Senarsal alive and publicly executed him before the city's population, a psychological tactic designed to demoralize other Aelid settlements. The fall of Ninandava marked a turning point in the campaign, as Pelinal began systematically targeting cities based on their strategic value rather than proximity. He developed a network of human scouts, many of them former slaves familiar with Aelid transportation routes, to gather intelligence about defensive capabilities and internal politics of remaining strongholds. This information allowed him to prioritize settlements whose fall would create maximum disruption to Aelid coordination and supply networks. The Aelid city-state of Sarchel exemplified the advantages of this strategic approach. Though not among the largest Aelid settlements, Sarchel controlled a critical junction in the magical conduit system that facilitated communication between White Gold Tower and outlying regions. By capturing this seemingly minor outpost, Pelinal effectively isolated the Aelid capital from its supporting territories, preventing coordinated responses to subsequent Alessian advances. Throughout these campaigns, Pelinal demonstrated an uncanny understanding of Aelid magical infrastructure that puzzled even his closest allies. He identified vulnerabilities in enchanted defenses that should have been undetectable to non-Aelids, leading some contemporaries to speculate that he possessed knowledge from previous encounters with elven civilizations, perhaps in other eras or realms. This theory gained credibility when he accurately predicted the locations of hidden magical reservoirs beneath Sarchel that had not appeared on any captured maps. The most decisive exploitation of Aelid political fragmentation occurred during the campaign against the twin cities of Tor and Varlaesvia. These settlements, though physically adjacent, were ruled by rival branches of the same dynastic family who had maintained a ceremonial state of war for 3 centuries without actual conflict. When Pelinal's forces approached Tor, its rulers activated ancient defensive pacts that required Varlaesvia to send military aid. The rulers of Varlaesvia, however, interpreted these pacts according to their own legal traditions, sending only token forces while withholding their elite mage guards. Pelinal capitalized on this division by concentrating his attack on Tor while positioning a smaller force to intercept and eliminate the limited reinforcements from Varlaesvia. After Tor fell, he immediately pivoted his main army toward Varlaesvia before its rulers could fully comprehend the situation. The second city fell within hours, its defenses compromised by the absence of the mage guards who had been dispatched as nominal support to Tor. This efficient conquest of 2 major settlements with minimal Alessian casualties demonstrated Pelinal's ability to transform Aelid political dysfunction into tactical advantage. As Pelinal's campaign progressed, a pattern emerged in his treatment of conquered populations that reflected his personal vendetta against Aelid civilization. In settlements that had practiced particularly cruel forms of human enslavement, he implemented what later historians would term complete erasure, the systematic destruction of all Aelid cultural artifacts, architectural features, and written records. Archaeological excavations of these sites reveal layers of deliberate demolition, with statues methodically defaced and libraries reduced to ash. This cultural warfare reached its apex following the capture of Malada, known among slaves as the Terrible Crystal. This settlement had specialized in flesh sculpture, the magical modification of living humans for aesthetic and experimental purposes. Upon discovering chambers containing still living victims of these practices, Pelinal entered one of his berserker states. The destruction that followed was so complete that modern archaeologists have been unable to determine Malada's original layout or architectural style. The only structures left partially intact were the slave quarters, which Pelinal ordered preserved as testament to Aelid cruelty. Throughout his campaign, Pelinal maintained a particular focus on locations associated with Umaril the Unfeathered, the Aelid sorcerer king, who had emerged as the primary coordinator of resistance against the Alessian forces. This personal vendetta stemmed from more than strategic considerations. According to fragments of the Song of Pelinal preserved in the Imperial Library, Pelinal viewed Umaril as the last echo of a greater enemy, a cryptic reference that some scholars interpret as connecting Umaril to entities Pelinal had encountered in other times or realms. Umaril's distinctive position among the Aelid leadership derived from his supernatural heritage as a half-Daedric being, the offspring of an Aelid noble and a lesser Daedric entity in service to Meridia. This lineage granted him magical abilities beyond those of typical Aelid sorcerers, and a form of conditional immortality that allowed his spirit to return to the colored rooms, Meridia's plane of oblivion, upon physical death. Pelinal appeared to understand these metaphysical aspects of his adversary, specifically targeting locations where Eumeril had established anchors to maintain his connection to Mundus. The destruction of Eumeril's ritual sites became a secondary campaign within Pelinal's broader crusade. At Elenglan, he demolished a crystal tower where Eumeril had conducted ceremonies to strengthen his Daedric heritage. In the ruins of Moraheim, he systematically eliminated a complex of light wells that channeled Meridia's influence directly into the mortal plane. These precise strikes against Eumeril's power sources demonstrated knowledge of Daedric metaphysics that exceeded contemporary understanding, further supporting theories about Pelinal's otherworldly origins. The most strategically significant engagement in Pelinal's anti-Eumeril campaign occurred at Narlami, a seemingly minor Aelid outpost that concealed a major anchor point for Daedric influence. Beneath the settlement's unassuming surface structures lay an extensive complex of ritual chambers where Eumeril had established a permanent portal to the colored rooms. Pelinal led a small force of specially selected fighters into these subterranean levels, confronting not just Aelid defenders, but Daedric entities summoned through the portal. The battle for Narlami's underground complex lasted 3 days, with Pelinal personally holding the central chamber against waves of Aurorans, Meridia's Daedric servitors sent to protect Eumeril's investment. When the fighting concluded, Pelinal had not only eliminated the Aelid presence, but implemented a ritual of his own design that permanently sealed the connection to oblivion. Magical residue from this ritual persists at the site even in the Fourth Era, creating a dead zone where conjuration magic fails and Daedric influences cannot penetrate. As Pelinal's campaign approached White Gold Tower, the remaining independent Aelid city-states faced an existential decision: ally with the central authority under Eumeril or attempt separate negotiations with Alessia. The settlement of Garla's Malader chose the former, becoming Eumeril's primary stronghold outside the capital and receiving significant reinforcement from Daedric sources. In contrast, the rulers of Bravil attempted to establish diplomatic relations with the Alessians, offering to free their human slaves in exchange for autonomy under the new regime. Pelinal's response to these divergent approaches revealed the extent to which his personal vendetta against Eumeril had become the driving force of his campaign. He postponed a planned assault on Garla's Malader, a decision that puzzled his military advisors given the settlement's strategic importance, to personally lead an attack on Bravil despite its diplomatic overtures. This prioritization reflected his understanding that Bravil contained ancestral artifacts connected to Eumeril's Aelid lineage that strengthened his adversary's connection to Mundus. The systematic destruction Pelinal Whitestake unleashed upon the Aelid civilization transcended conventional warfare, entering the realm of cultural annihilation that continues to trouble scholars and theologians into the Fourth Era. Behind the celebratory accounts of human liberation lies a darker narrative of calculated extinction that targeted not only Aelid military forces, but their entire way of life. The most graphic accounts of Pelinal's campaign come from fragments of Aelid records that survived his purges. These texts describe rivers literally running red with elven blood following his attacks. At Sedor, Aelid chroniclers recorded that the Russicrux River remained contaminated for 2 full seasons after Pelinal's assault, with fish dying upon contact with the water. Modern archaeological analysis of sediment layers at this site confirms an unusual concentration of mineralized blood residue consistent with mass casualties, supporting these otherwise hyperbolic-sounding accounts. Pelinal's methodical approach to destroying Aelid culture became most evident in his treatment of captured cities. Unlike conventional conquerors who typically preserved valuable infrastructure, Pelinal instituted what imperial historians euphemistically termed complete removal, the systematic destruction of all distinctly Aelid elements within a settlement. At Narlami, he ordered the toppling of the central observatory tower that had stood for over 3,000 years, containing astronomical records dating back to the early Merethic era. This destruction eliminated irreplaceable scientific knowledge that had no direct connection to the practice of slavery or Daedra worship. The architectural losses alone represent an incalculable cultural tragedy. Aeolid structures incorporated unique acoustic properties that created harmonics impossible to replicate with modern techniques. Their buildings utilized mathematical principles that imperial architects still cannot fully comprehend. At Malada, Pelinal directed his forces to dismantle the Crystal Tower methodically, ensuring that no section remained intact enough to study its construction. Similar patterns of deliberate architectural obliteration appear at virtually every site Pelinal conquered. The destruction of written records proved even more comprehensive. Aeolid libraries contain texts dating back to the earliest days of Elven settlement in Cyrodiil, including first-hand accounts of the Aldmer migration from Aldmeris. These irreplaceable historical documents were specifically targeted during Pelinal's campaigns. At Seatatar, witnesses described him spending 3 days personally overseeing the burning of the archive, while more pressing military matters awaited his attention, underscoring that this destruction was not collateral damage but a deliberate policy. This cultural erasure extended to religious artifacts regardless of their association with Daedra worship. Even items dedicated to Edric worship, the same divines venerated by Alessia's followers, faced destruction when of Aeolid origin. The Temple of the Ancestors at Elengland contained reliquaries dedicated to Oriel that had no connection to human subjugation, yet Pelinal ordered them melted down, and the materials used to forge weapons for his human troops. This indiscriminate destruction suggests his campaign targeted Aeolid identity itself, rather than merely their political dominance or specific religious practices. Perhaps most disturbing was Pelinal's approach to non-combatant Aeolid populations. Unlike Alessia, who distinguished between Aeolid leadership and ordinary citizens, Pelinal implemented what modern scholars would classify as systematic genocide. At Narlami, archaeological evidence indicates that the civilian population had been herded into the central market square before being systematically executed. Skeletal remains show a pattern of precision neck wounds consistent with methodical killing rather than the chaos of combat. Similar evidence appears at multiple sites where Pelinal led assaults, suggesting a standardized approach to civilian elimination. The treatment of Aeolid children represents the most controversial aspect of Pelinal's campaign. Excavations at Sard revealed a mass burial site containing the remains of approximately 200 Aeolid juveniles, many showing evidence of having been killed by a single weapon type consistent with the descriptions of Pelinal's sword. Contemporary accounts from the Song of Pelinal omit these details entirely, while Alessian records euphemistically refer to removing the seedlings of tyranny, a phrase that appears repeatedly in military communications from this period. Pelinal's justification for this comprehensive approach appears in fragments of personal correspondence preserved in the Imperial Library. In a letter to Alessia following the fall of Seatatar, he wrote, "The error lies not in their actions, but in their essence. So long as one remains who remembers their ways, the shadow of the towers will fall again upon human lands." This essentialist view of Aeolid nature as inherently oppressive provided the philosophical foundation for his systematic eradication of their civilization. The environmental impact of Pelinal's campaign extended beyond metaphorical rivers of blood. His destruction of Aeolid magical infrastructure had lasting consequences for Cyrodiil's ecosystem. The White Gold Tower and its supporting structures regulated regional weather patterns through a network of focus stones and light wells. As Pelinal systematically destroyed these regulatory systems, parts of Cyrodiil experienced unprecedented weather extremes. Historical climate records indicate that the 5 years following the fall of White Gold Tower saw the most severe flooding in the Naibne Basin since the Dawn Era, followed by a decade-long drought that decimated agricultural production. The magical consequences proved equally severe. Aeolid settlements incorporated sophisticated spell containment systems that managed dangerous magical energies. When these systems were destroyed without proper deactivation, the released energies created zones of persistent magical disruption. The region surrounding the former city of Varlaisel remains magically unstable into the Fourth Era, with unpredictable conjuration effects and spontaneous transmutation phenomena reported regularly. These magical dead zones represent an ongoing, hazard directly attributable to Pelinal's indiscriminate destruction. Modern scholarly perspectives on Pelinal's methods have evolved considerably since the uncritical heroic narratives of early imperial histories. The University of Gwilym's Department of Retroactive Ethics has developed an analytical framework that acknowledges both the moral complexity of the Alessian rebellion's context and the excessive nature of Pelinal's response. Professor Luciella Sextius, chair of Aeolid Studies, argues, recognizing the legitimate grievances of enslaved humans doesn't require us to endorse Pelinal's methodical eradication of an entire civilization. The historical record clearly shows he went far beyond military necessity into the realm of cultural obliteration. This reassessment gained momentum following the discovery of the Jultime tablets at Miskarkand in 3E412. These remarkably preserved Aeolid records contained first-hand accounts of Pelinal's campaigns from the perspective of survivors, including details systematically omitted from imperial histories. The tablets describe Pelinal not as a liberator, but as the White Death who speaks with the voice of countless screaming souls. They documented his practice of forcing captured Aeolid nobles to watch the execution of their families before killing them, psychological torture absent from Alessian accounts. The Arcane University's recent magical reconstruction of battle sites has provided additional evidence of Pelinal's excessive methods. Using specialized illusion magic to recreate events based on residual energies, researchers have visualized several of his major engagements. These reconstructions show that at Sard, Pelinal continued killing unarmed Aeolids for hours after all military resistance had ceased, methodically moving through residential districts to eliminate survivors hiding in cellars and storage rooms. Similar patterns appeared in reconstructions of 6 other major battles, suggesting this was standard practice rather than an isolated incident. The ethical implications extend beyond the immediate casualties to the permanent loss of knowledge and culture. Aeolid astronomical understanding surpassed anything achieved since, incorporating mathematical principles that imperial science rediscovered only in the late Third Era. Their acoustic engineering created spaces with healing properties that modern restoration magic cannot replicate. Their metallurgical techniques produced alloys with properties still not fully understood by contemporary smiths. This irreplaceable knowledge was specifically targeted by Pelinal, suggesting he understood its value and deliberately sought its eradication. Not all modern scholars condemn Pelinal's methods without qualification. The Imperial War College's Department of Historical Conflict Studies has argued that the totality of his approach must be understood within the context of asymmetric warfare. Professor Quintus Varanius contends, the Alessian forces faced an enemy with overwhelming magical superiority and entrenched political power. Conventional military approaches would have failed against such advantages. The comprehensive nature of Pelinal's campaign, while disturbing to modern sensibilities, prevented any possibility of Aeolid resurgence that might have reversed human liberation. This pragmatic defense remains controversial, particularly among Elven historians. Altmary scholar Lindirian of Cloudrest has documented the broader impact of Pelinal's campaign on Marish cultures throughout Tamriel. His research demonstrates that the trauma of the Alessian rebellion reverberated far beyond Cyrodiil, influencing Altmary policies toward humans for thousands of years and contributing to the isolationist tendencies that characterized much of Somerset's history. The memory of Pelinal became a cautionary tale among all Elven peoples about the existential threat posed by unchecked human expansion. The theological dimension of Pelinal's campaign adds another layer of complexity to modern ethical assessments. If, as substantial evidence suggests, Pelinal was indeed a Shezarene, a mortal incarnation of the missing god Lorkhan, then his actions represented more than military strategy. They constituted a continuation of the cosmic struggle between Lorkhan and the Elven ancestors who opposed material creation. Under this interpretation, Pelinal's eradication of Aeolid civilization represented the playing out of divine conflicts through mortal proxies, raising profound questions about agency and culpability. The Synod's theological position holds that divine intervention in mortal affairs does not absolve participants of moral responsibility. High Chancellor of Tharn's famous treatise on divine agency and mortal choice argues that even if Pelinal acted as an instrument of divine will, the specific methods he employed reflected choices made within the scope of his mission. This perspective maintains that the extremity of his approach cannot be dismissed as merely the inevitable unfolding of cosmic will. Pelinal's own statements about his methods, preserved in fragments of the song, reveal a calculated philosophy behind his brutality. After the destruction of Seatatar, he reportedly told Morihaus, "I do not hate what they are, but what they would forever be if left to their devices. The memory of cruelty lives longer than its practitioners." This statement suggests he viewed cultural annihilation as preventative rather than punitive, a perspective that troubles modern ethicists who see in it the seeds of justification for atrocities throughout subsequent imperial history. The practical consequences of Pelinal's methods extended far beyond the immediate conflict. By eliminating Aelid knowledge so thoroughly, he inadvertently created a technological and magical regression that affected human development for centuries. The early Alessian Empire struggled to maintain basic infrastructure without the magical techniques that had supported Aelid civilization. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, agricultural productivity declined, and architectural knowledge regressed to more primitive forms. This post-liberation decline created hardships for the very human populations Pelinal had ostensibly fought to free. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of Pelinal's campaign was its influence on subsequent imperial approaches to cultural difference. The Alessian Order, which rose to prominence following the rebellion, adopted increasingly extreme anti-Elven policies inspired by Pelinal's example. Their doctrinal position that Elven blood represented a spiritual contamination led to purges of Elven influences throughout Cyrodiil and eventually to aggressive expansionism justified as continuing Pelinal's work. The Alessian doctrines, which dominated imperial religious and political life for centuries, institutionalized prejudices that can be traced directly to Pelinal's essentialist view of Elven nature. Among the complex web of relationships that define the Alessian rebellion, none proved more consequential than the triumvirate formed by Pelinal Whitestake, Morihaus, and Alessia herself. This alliance transcended mere military cooperation, evolving into deep personal bonds that would shape the course of Cyrodiilic history. Pelinal's first encounter with Morihaus occurred shortly after his arrival in Cyrodiil. The Song of Pelinal describes their meeting as the joining of storm and fury, referring to Morihaus's nature as the son of Kine, Nordic goddess of storms, and Pelinal's legendary battle rage. Initial accounts suggest a cautious assessment between the two warriors, each recognizing in the other a power beyond ordinary mortal capabilities. Morihaus, often called the Breath of Kine, appeared as a man with the head of a bull, his massive frame adorned with ancient Nordic symbols of his divine heritage. His physical strength exceeded even that of giants, allowing him to tear down Aelid gates with his bare hands. This raw power complemented Pelinal's precise martial skill, creating a devastating combination on the battlefield. Their initial cooperation quickly developed into a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. While Alessia provided the rebellion's spiritual foundation, Pelinal and Morihaus formed its martial backbone. The two warriors developed battlefield tactics that maximized their complementary abilities, Morihaus using his tremendous strength to breach fortifications, while Pelinal exploited these openings with surgical strikes against Aelid leadership. Archaeological evidence from battle sites reveals their coordinated approach. At Sard, excavations show damage patterns consistent with Morihaus's distinctive horn marks on the main gate, followed by precision cuts to internal structural supports that match Pelinal's blade width. This pattern appears at multiple Aelid ruins, suggesting a standardized tactical approach developed through extensive cooperation. Beyond the battlefield, their personal relationship grew increasingly intimate. The uncensored fragments of the Song of Pelinal, preserved in the Arcane University archives, describe evenings spent in shared quarters, where the two warriors would speak of matters beyond mortal understanding, their voices low and close as lovers. These passages were systematically removed from official imperial versions of the song, reflecting later discomfort with the nature of their bond. The most explicit reference to their relationship appears in the infamous 8th stanza of the song, where Pelinal is described as shining with a love that would eventually be his undoing. The passage continues, Pelinal loved Morehouse as only those who have glimpsed eternity can love, with a devotion transcending the boundaries of flesh and time. This section was entirely excised from versions of the song published after the rise of the Alessian order, which adopted increasingly strict positions on proper religious and personal conduct. Historical records from the early Alessian period contain scattered references to the depth of their connection. In the personal correspondence of Lady Perif, one of Alessia's closest confidants, she describes witnessing Pelinal tending to Morihouse's wounds after the Battle of Vatessen. The White Knight knelt before the bull, his hands gentle as a healer's despite their strength. He spoke words I could not understand, in a language that seemed to calm the very air around them. The bull's pain visibly eased at his touch. This tenderness contrasted sharply with Pelinal's behavior toward others. Even among his human allies, he maintained a certain distance, his manner often described as abrupt or aloof. Only with Morehouse did he display genuine warmth, suggesting a unique emotional connection that transcended his otherwise single-minded focus on the rebellion. Their battlefield coordination reached its apex during the Siege of Seatatar, where contemporary accounts describe them moving as though sharing one mind. When Aelid mages created a magical barrier separating the two warriors, witnesses reported that Pelinal and Morehouse independently developed identical strategies to reunite, approaching the barrier from precisely calculated angles that caused it to collapse. This level of synchronicity led some observers to suggest a metaphysical connection between them, perhaps related to their shared divine associations. The relationship between Pelinal and Alessia proved more complex and nuanced. While Morehouse served Alessia out of filial devotion to his divine mother Kine, who had sent him to aid the rebellion, Pelinal's loyalty to Alessia stemmed from recognition of her unique destiny. He addressed her as Al-Esh, or sometimes Paravent, terms with specific theological significance in the emerging Alessian belief system. Al-Esh, meaning the high priestess in an ancient Nedic dialect, acknowledged Alessia's spiritual authority and her claimed direct communication with the divines. Haravint, a term with no clear etymological origin in any known Tamrilic language, appears to reference her role as a vessel for divine will, a first mover who initiated a new historical cycle. Pelinal's use of these terms instead of her common name suggests he viewed her primarily through a metaphysical lens rather than a personal one. Despite this apparent formality, surviving fragments of correspondence between Pelinal and Alessia reveal a relationship of profound mutual respect. In a letter written after the fall of Sard, Alessia confided to Pelinal her doubts about her ability to govern the territories they had liberated. "The people look to me for wisdom I do not possess. They expect a ruler, but I have only ever been a slave and a seer." Pelinal's response demonstrated unexpected sensitivity. "You have always been what they needed, even before they knew they needed it. The crown you will wear was forged in your heart long before it will touch your brow." This exchange reveals a dimension of Pelinal rarely seen in public, a capacity for empathy and emotional insight that contrasted with his battlefield persona. With Alessia, he occasionally set aside the mantle of the implacable warrior to serve as counselor and confidant. This aspect of their relationship became particularly important during the middle phase of the rebellion, when initial victories gave way to the challenges of governance. The triangular relationship between these three leaders created a balance that proved crucial to the rebellion's success. When Pelinal's berserker rages threatened to undermine their cause through excessive brutality, Alessia would intervene through Morehouse, who alone could approach Pelinal in such states without risk. Similarly, when Alessia faced opposition from human tribal leaders who questioned her authority, Pelinal's unequivocal support, backed by his fearsome reputation, secured their compliance. This dynamic is exemplified in the aftermath of the Sedor massacre, when Pelinal's indiscriminate slaughter of Aedra-worshipping Aelids threatened to alienate potential allies. Historical records describe how Alessia sent Morehouse to confront Pelinal, finding him blood-soaked and still trembling with rage. According to accounts preserved in the Imperial Library, Morehouse physically embraced Pelinal despite the blood, speaking softly until the White Knight's breathing slowed and his posture relaxed. When Alessia arrived hours later, she found them seated together, Pelinal listening attentively as she explained the strategic importance of distinguishing between different Aelid factions. The personal nature of Pelinal's devotion to Alessia became most evident following her injury during the Battle of Ninendava. When an Aelid spell arrow struck Alessia, temporarily paralyzing her, Pelinal abandoned his position, leading the vanguard to personally escort her to safety. This decision, militarily unsound given his critical role in the assault, demonstrated that his loyalty transcended strategic considerations. He remained at her bedside for 3 days until her recovery, neglecting pressing military matters despite Morihouse's urging to return to the field. The intimate connection between Pelinal and Morehouse occasionally created tension within the triumvirate. Alessian records hint at Alessia's concern that their close bond might compromise military objectivity. In a private communication to her priestess Perif, Alessia noted, "The White Knight and the Bull move increasingly as one, their eyes seeking each other across the council table before any decision is made. I wonder sometimes if they remember that this war extends beyond their shared gaze." This observation proved prescient during the campaign against Lindai, when Morehouse was temporarily captured by Aelid forces. Pelinal abandoned the carefully crafted battle plan, leading a reckless direct assault on the Aelid position holding Morehouse. While successful in freeing his companion, this impulsive action cost dozens of Alessian lives and delayed the broader offensive by several weeks. When Alessia questioned this decision, Pelinal reportedly responded, "Some bonds transcend strategy. I would tear down the walls of oblivion itself if he were held beyond them." The most controversial aspect of their triangular relationship emerges in the censored portions of the Song of Pelinal that describe intimate moments between Pelinal and Morehouse. These passages, preserved only in fragmentary form in the Arcane University's restricted archives, suggest a romantic and physical dimension to their bond. One partially recovered section describes them as finding in each other's embrace a solace that neither battle nor victory could provide, their bodies joined as completely as their purpose. The systematic removal of these references from official histories reflects the changing attitudes of the later Alessian order, which developed increasingly rigid views on proper relationships. The theological implications of a divine champion engaging in such a relationship with a demigod proved problematic for the emerging religious orthodoxy, leading to a deliberate reshaping of their historical bond into one of purely martial brotherhood. The complex relationship between these three leaders found its most poignant expression in the final days before the assault on White Gold Tower. Historical accounts describe a private meeting in Alessia's tent where the three shared wine and reflected on their journey. According to a witness account from one of Alessia's handmaidens, preserved in the collection of the Laoian Historical Society, Pelinal spoke with uncharacteristic emotion. "Whatever comes tomorrow, know that I have found in both of you something I thought lost forever, a purpose beyond vengeance, a connection to this world I had forgotten." This rare moment of vulnerability foreshadowed the coming tragedy. The following day, Pelinal would enter White Gold Tower in pursuit of Eumeril, leading to his dismemberment and death. His final recorded words, spoken to Morehouse before this fatal assault, hint at a premonition of his fate. "If I do not return, remember me not as I was in rage, but as I am in this moment, looking upon you with clear eyes." The grief that followed Pelinal's death revealed the true depth of both relationships. Morehouse's reaction transcended conventional mourning. Witnesses described him entering a state of frenzy comparable to Pelinal's own berserker rages, his attacks against remaining Aelid forces marked by unprecedented brutality. For weeks afterward, he would return to the chamber where Pelinal's remains had been found, sometimes remaining there in silence for days. Alessia's response proved more controlled but no less profound. She ordered the recovery of every fragment of Pelinal's body and armor, personally overseeing their placement in a specially constructed reliquary beneath what would become the Temple of the One. The elaborate preservation rituals she instituted for his remains went far beyond standard honors for fallen warriors, incorporating elements that would later evolve into core practices of the Alessian faith. In the aftermath of the rebellion's success, both Alessia and Morehouse would reference Pelinal in ways that transcended his military contribution. Alessia's early imperial decrees frequently invoked the spirit of the White Knight as a guiding principle, suggesting she viewed him as more than a champion, but as an embodiment of the new order she sought to establish. Morehouse, in the few personal writings attributed to him, referred to Pelinal as the other half of my soul, a phrase with specific theological significance in early Alessian doctrine relating to divine completeness. The assault on the White Gold Tower represented the culmination of Pelinal Whitestrake's campaign against the Aelids, a final confrontation that would determine the fate of Cyrodiil. After the fall of strategic outlying settlements, the remaining Aelid forces had withdrawn to their capital, consolidating their strength around the ancient structure that served as both the physical and metaphysical center of their civilization. White Gold Tower stood unlike any other structure in Tamriel. Rising 800 feet above the central island of Lake Rumer, its gleaming spire was visible from nearly anywhere in the Nibene Basin. The tower functioned as more than merely the seat of Aelid governance. It represented one of the few remaining tower structures from the Dawn era, a stabilizing pin in the fabric of reality itself. Constructed according to principles established at Ada Mantia, the first tower, White Gold, possessed unique properties that transcended conventional architecture. The Alessian forces approached the capital from multiple directions, having secured control of the surrounding countryside through previous campaigns. Reconnaissance reports delivered to Pelinal indicated that Umaril the Unfeathered had implemented unprecedented defensive measures. The standard magical barriers that protected Aelid settlements had been reinforced with additional layers of spellcraft, drawing power directly from White Gold itself. These defenses created a shimmering dome of magical energy that enveloped the entire central island. Pelinal spent 3 days observing these defenses from the western shore of Lake Rumer. Unlike previous sieges where he had relied primarily on martial strength, he recognized that breaching the capital would require a more sophisticated approach. The magical barrier repelled conventional projectiles and prevented any physical approach by boat or swimming. Attempts by Alessian battle mages to counter the barrier had proven ineffective, as the tower's connection to fundamental creatia provided seemingly limitless magical resources to maintain the defenses. The solution Pelinal devised demonstrated his unusual understanding of Aelid magical infrastructure. Beneath Lake Rumer ran a network of enchanted conduits that channeled magical energy from outlying Welkin stone deposits to the central tower. These underwater pathways had been established during the early construction of White Gold to supplement the tower's natural collection of creatia from Etherius. By targeting these conduits, Pelinal realized he could potentially disrupt the barrier without having to overcome it directly. Pelinal selected a small team of former slaves who had worked on maintaining these conduits during their captivity. Their intimate knowledge of the underwater network proved invaluable as they identified vulnerable junction points where multiple channels converged. Using specialized tools crafted by Alessian mages according to Pelinal's specifications, these infiltrators descended to the lake bed and placed disruptive devices at strategic locations. These devices represented another example of Pelinal's anachronistic knowledge. Combining alchemical compounds with soul gem fragments configured in specific geometric patterns, they generated interference fields that disrupted the flow of magicka without physically damaging the conduits. This approach prevented catastrophic magical backlash while still achieving the desired effect of weakening the barrier. Archaeological investigations in the Fourth Era have recovered fragments of these devices, confirming their sophisticated design that incorporated principles of magicka manipulation not formally discovered until the Second Era. As the devices activated, visible effects manifested in the barrier surrounding the city. The previously uniform shimmer developed fluctuating intensities, with noticeable thinning at regular intervals corresponding to the disrupted conduits. Pelinal had anticipated this pattern and positioned the main Alessian force to exploit these weaknesses when they reached their minimum strength. The actual breach occurred during the dawn of the 302nd day of the year 1E242, a date specifically chosen by Pelinal for its astronomical significance. This particular morning featured a conjunction of celestial bodies that the Aeolids considered inauspicious, a configuration they called the Thief's Shadow. Historical records indicate that Aeolid magical defenses traditionally underwent maintenance during such periods to avoid negative influences. By striking at precisely this moment, Pelinal exploited both the physical weakening of the barrier and the psychological impact on its maintainers. The initial assault force comprised 3 specialized units. The vanguard, led by Pelinal himself, targeted the weakest section of the barrier directly opposite the main gate. Morehouse commanded a secondary force positioned to exploit any additional breaches that might form as a result of the primary assault. A third contingent of Alessian battle mages stood ready to establish counter wards, preventing the barrier from resealing once breached. When Pelinal reached the fluctuating section of the barrier, he employed another example of his unique capabilities. Witnesses described how he raised his left hand, which began emitting the terrible light mentioned in earlier accounts. Where this light touched the barrier, the magical energies appeared to fold inward upon themselves, creating a localized collapse. This technique for magical disruption demonstrated principles that would not be formally understood until Shalador's work on spell breaking in the late First Era. The opening created by this method allowed Pelinal and his vanguard to pass through, establishing a foothold on the island. Morehouse quickly exploited this success, leading his forces through the breach before the Aeolid mages could respond. The battle mage contingent immediately began establishing ward anchors around the perimeter of the opening, preventing the barrier from reconstituting itself. Within the city itself, the Alessian forces encountered a defense-in-depth strategy unlike anything seen in previous engagements. The Aeolids had transformed the capital's concentric layout into a series of nested defensive positions, each designed to slow the human advance and inflict maximum casualties. Streets that had once facilitated movement through the city were now blocked by magical barriers keyed to elven blood, allowing Aeolid defenders to pass freely while forcing the attackers to find alternative routes. Pelinal countered this strategy by dividing his forces into smaller, more mobile units familiar with urban combat. Rather than attempting to clear every street and structure, these teams focused on securing key junctions and neutralizing the ward anchors that powered the interior barriers. This approach reflected Pelinal's understanding of Aeolid magical urban planning, specifically how their cities channeled and distributed magical energy through architectural features. The fighting intensified as the Alessian forces approached the central districts surrounding White Gold Tower itself. Here, the Aeolids had concentrated their most elite warriors and powerful mages. Unlike the desperate last stands seen in other cities, these defenders operated according to a coordinated plan, using the urban terrain to channel attackers into prepared ambush points. Pelinal recognized this strategy and implemented a countermeasure that demonstrated his tactical flexibility. Rather than continuing the direct approach, he ordered his forces to secure and occupy specific buildings that corresponded to nodes in the city's magical infrastructure. These locations, identifiable by distinctive architectural features known to former slaves in his army, served as distribution points for the magical energy flowing from the tower to the city's defensive systems. By controlling these nodes, the Alessian forces gradually diminished the magical advantages enjoyed by the defenders. Barriers began failing, enchanted weapons lost their power, and communication systems between Aeolid units broke down. This methodical dismantling of the city's magical support network represented a sophisticated understanding of urban warfare adapted to a context where magic formed an integral part of the battlefield. As the outer districts fell, the remaining Aeolid forces withdrew to the tower itself and the surrounding governmental complex. This central area featured the most formidable defenses, including physical barriers enhanced by permanent enchantments tied directly to the tower's fundamental nature as a metaphysical structure. The conventional wisdom among Alessian commanders suggested a protracted siege of this final position, allowing time to bring additional forces and supplies. Pelinal rejected this approach, recognizing that a prolonged engagement would allow the Aelid leadership to potentially activate contingency measures or summon Daedric assistance. Instead, he proposed an immediate assault focused on breaching the tower itself, where he believed Umaril and the remaining Aelid kings had gathered. This decision reflected his persistent focus on decapitating Aelid leadership rather than merely occupying territory. The approach to the tower required crossing an open plaza deliberately designed to expose attackers to magical fire from elevated positions. Conventional tactics would have proven suicidal against such defenses. Pelinal instead utilized knowledge gained from former slaves who had worked in the tower's maintenance. These individuals identified a network of service tunnels that ran beneath the plaza, originally designed to allow discreet movement of servants and supplies. Leading a small force of his most trusted warriors, Pelinal infiltrated these tunnels, while the main Alessian army maintained pressure on the plaza defenses as a diversion. The narrow passages prevented the use of conventional formations, forcing the attackers to advance in single file through sections barely wide enough for an armored warrior. This approach carried significant risks, as ambushes in such confined spaces could prove devastating. The Aelids had indeed prepared for this possibility, placing magical wards and traps throughout the tunnel system. Here, Pelinal's mysterious armor proved particularly valuable, as its resistance to magic allowed him to trigger and survive traps that would have killed conventional warriors. Behind him, a specialist unit of Alessian mages worked to disarm or neutralize these defenses, gradually securing a safe passage for the forces following them. The tunnels emerged in the lower levels of the tower itself, allowing Pelinal's force to bypass the heaviest exterior defenses. The interior of White Gold presented a different challenge, a complex labyrinth of chambers and passageways designed to confuse invaders and separate them into vulnerable groups. The layout incorporated magical elements that could reconfigure sections of the tower in response to intrusion, potentially trapping attackers in dead-end corridors or rooms without exits. Pelinal navigated this labyrinth with unexpected familiarity, leading his forces directly toward the upper chambers, where he believed the Aelid leadership had gathered. This knowledge of the tower's interior layout surprised even the former slaves in his company, who had only accessed limited sections during their captivity. His apparent understanding of the structure's complete design added to the growing evidence that Pelinal possessed knowledge that transcended conventional explanation. As they ascended through the tower's levels, Pelinal's force encountered increasingly elite Aelid defenders. These included not only conventional warriors, but specialized battle mages, whose magical abilities had been enhanced through direct connection to the tower's power. The confined spaces within the structure limited Pelinal's ability to employ the formation tactics that had proven effective in open battles, forcing a more individualized combat approach. The most significant resistance occurred in the Ancestral Chamber, a vast hall located approximately 2/3 of the way up the tower. This ceremonial space contained reliquaries holding the remains of previous Aelid kings, their preserved spirits providing additional magical power to the defenders. Here, 5 Aelid sorcerer kings made their stand, each commanding elements that corresponded to different aspects of Aelid magical tradition. The battle that followed represented one of the most intense magical confrontations of the entire rebellion. The Sorcerer Kings coordinated their spellcraft to create overlapping fields of destructive energy, while simultaneously animating the ceremonial armor displays that lined the chamber's walls. Pelinal countered by employing the disruptive light from his left hand to create temporary gaps in the magical fields, allowing his warriors to engage the kings directly. 3 of the Sorcerer Kings fell to conventional combat once their magical protections were compromised. The 4th, a specialist in temporal manipulation, proved more challenging. This king, identified in later records as Senarsal the Unmoving, created localized distortions in time that caused attacking weapons to slow to imperceptible speeds before reaching him. Pelinal overcame this defense by throwing his own sword directly through a distortion field, then physically charging into the same field. The unexpected mass entering the temporal effect caused it to collapse, allowing Pelinal to reach Senarsal and eliminate him before he could establish a new defense. The final Sorcerer King, Larchausel of the Thousand Eyes, employed an unusual form of scrying magic that allowed him to simultaneously perceive and attack from multiple angles. This ability made conventional approaches impossible, as he could anticipate and counter any movement. Pelinal defeated this opponent by exploiting a fundamental limitation of scrying magic, its inability to perceive objects or individuals with certain divine protections. His armor's mysterious properties apparently included such protection, rendering him partially invisible to Larchausel's magical perception and allowing him to approach undetected from the king's blind spot. With the ancestral chamber secured, Pelinal's force continued their ascent toward the uppermost levels of the tower where Eumeril awaited. The remaining distance featured fewer conventional defenders, but increasingly abstract magical hazards. Entire sections of corridor existed in multiple states simultaneously, requiring precise timing to navigate. Other areas contained atmospheres hostile to human physiology, necessitating protective measures developed by Alessian alchemists based on Pelinal's specifications. Throughout this ascent, the tower itself seemed to respond to their presence. Witnesses described walls that rippled like water when touched, floors that became temporarily intangible, and gravity that shifted direction without warning. These effects represented more than mere defensive enchantments. They demonstrated the tower's nature as a structure existing partially outside conventional physical laws, its interior spaces reflecting its role as a metaphysical pin stabilizing reality. Pelinal navigated these hazards with the same unexpected familiarity he had shown with the tower's layout. When faced with a chamber where time flowed backward, he instructed his warriors to walk backward while thinking in reverse order. When confronted with a section where spatial dimensions folded upon themselves, he led them through by following a pattern based on specific numerical sequences. This knowledge of how to traverse such metaphysically complex spaces further distinguished him from conventional military leaders. The final approach to Eumeril's position required passing through the lightless chamber, a space described in Alessian records as a void in the shape of a room. This area contained no conventional light, sound, or even air, existing as a buffer zone between normal reality and the altered space surrounding the tower's apex. Crossing this void required specialized magical preparation, as normal physical processes including breathing and heartbeat would cease to function within it. The final confrontation between Pelinal Whitestake and Eumeril, the Unfeathered, took place in the highest chamber of the White Gold Tower, a space unlike any other in Tamriel. Known as the Fane of Ancestral Whispers, this octagonal chamber sat directly beneath the tower's apex, its walls inscribed with the names of every Aelid king since their arrival in Cyrodiil. Magical light filtered through crystal apertures, creating patterns that shifted with the movements of celestial bodies. The chamber functioned as both throne room and ritual space, where the metaphysical properties of the tower could be directly accessed by those with sufficient knowledge. Eumeril awaited Pelinal's arrival with calculated composure. Unlike the desperate Aelid kings who had fallen before him, Eumeril projected absolute confidence. His physical form stood over 8 feet tall, his body adorned with armor of an unusual golden white metal that scholars later identified as ethereal in origin. Most distinctive were the vestigial wing structures extending from his shoulders, not functional wings but crystalline formations that captured and refracted light in hypnotic patterns. These unfeathered wings gave him his epithet and served as conduits for his unique magical abilities. What made Eumeril truly formidable was not merely his physical stature or martial prowess, but his nature as a half-Daedric being. Historical records confirm that his mother was an Aelid of royal lineage, while his father was a lesser Daedric entity in service to Meridia. This heritage granted him capabilities beyond those of conventional Aelid sorcerer kings, including a conditional immortality tied to his connection with Meridia's realm, the Colored Rooms. Pelinal entered the chamber alone, having ordered his remaining warriors to secure the lower levels against potential reinforcements. His armor bore the marks of the ascent, scorched by magical fire, dented from physical confrontations, yet still gleaming with its characteristic otherworldly light. His legendary sword, described in the song as straight and terrible as daylight, showed no damage despite the countless enchanted barriers it had sundered during the climb. The initial exchange between the two champions was not immediate combat, but a moment of mutual assessment. They circled the chamber's perimeter, separated by the width of the room, each measuring the other's movements and defenses. Yumeral carried a spear of unusual design, its shaft composed of intertwined strands of metal that occasionally separated and rejoined like living tendrils. The spearhead itself appeared to exist in multiple places simultaneously, an effect of Daedric enchantment that made its true position difficult to determine. The battle began with a display of Yumeral's Daedric heritage. He raised his free hand toward the chamber's ceiling, causing the ambient light to coalesce into tangible beams that struck at Pelinal from multiple angles. These beams carried Meridia's signature power, a burning light that could disintegrate undead and corrupt flesh. Against most opponents, such an attack would have been instantly fatal, but Pelinal's mysterious armor absorbed or deflected the majority of the energy, allowing him to advance through the barrage with only minor injuries. Pelinal countered with the strange light from his left hand, the same energy he had used to breach magical barriers throughout the campaign. Where this light touched Yumeral's armor, the metal briefly lost its cohesion, becoming momentarily malleable before reforming. This effect confirmed what some scholars had theorized. Pelinal's disruptive energy operated on fundamental principles of creation, temporarily suspending the defined properties of materials. The physical engagement that followed demonstrated combat skills far beyond mortal limitations. Yumeral's spear moved with impossible speed, sometimes appearing to strike from multiple directions simultaneously due to its Daedric enchantments. Pelinal matched this supernatural pace, his sword intercepting attacks that should have been imperceptible to human reflexes. The chamber itself reacted to their conflict, with floor tiles cracking under the force of their movements and wall inscriptions glowing in response to the magical energies they unleashed. Witnesses who observed the battle from lower levels of the tower reported that the entire structure trembled with each exchange. The magical reverberations affected the tower's connection to reality itself, causing temporary distortions that extended throughout the imperial city. Former slaves who had escaped to the mainland described seeing portions of the tower briefly vanish from view, only to reappear moments later, evidence that the confrontation transcended physical combat and affected the tower's metaphysical properties. The tide of battle shifted when Yumeral employed his most devastating ability, control over light itself. As a champion of Meridia, he could manipulate light not merely as illumination, but as a fundamental force. He created prismatic cascades that split into countless razor-sharp fragments, each capable of slicing through conventional armor. These light shards surrounded Pelinal, attacking from every conceivable angle and leaving him no path of retreat. Pelinal responded with a technique never before witnessed in his campaign. He plunged his sword into the floor of the chamber, creating a shockwave of counter-energy that temporarily neutralized all magical effects within the room. This action required such force that the sword embedded itself halfway to the hilt in the tower's enchanted floor, a material previously thought impervious to physical damage. The resulting magical vacuum provided a brief window where Yumeral's Daedric advantages were suppressed. In this moment of vulnerability, Pelinal closed the distance between them with extraordinary speed. The hand-to-hand combat that followed revealed that both champions possessed physical capabilities far beyond their apparent forms. Yumeral's strength, enhanced by his Daedric blood, allowed him to shatter pillars with glancing blows. Pelinal matched this power with a combination of precision and ferocity that suggested formal training in multiple martial disciplines spanning different eras. The critical turning point came when Pelinal managed to grasp one of Yumeral's crystalline wing structures. These formations, which channeled Meridia's influence into the physical plane, represented both a source of power and a potential vulnerability. With a precise application of his disruptive energy, Pelinal caused the crystal to fracture along specific axes, disrupting the patterns that maintained Yumeral's connection to his Daedric patron. This disruption created a visible effect. The golden light that had suffused Yumeral's form dimmed noticeably, and his movements became marginally slower. Recognizing this advantage, Pelinal pressed his attack with renewed intensity. His sword, retrieved from the floor in a fluid motion, now left lingering trails of white fire as it cut through the air, each strike precisely targeted at junctions in Eumeral's armor where the protective enchantments were weakest. Eumeral, sensing his disadvantage, attempted to re-establish his connection to Meridia by retreating to a specific position within the chamber where the tower's natural energies aligned with the colored rooms. Pelinal anticipated this maneuver, using his shield to disrupt Eumeral's movement and force him away from this metaphysical anchor point. This tactical awareness demonstrated Pelinal's understanding of the tower's internal magical geography, knowledge that no human should have possessed. The battle reached its crescendo when Eumeral, increasingly desperate, attempted to open a direct portal to oblivion within the chamber. Such a breach would have allowed Meridia's direct influence to enter the tower, potentially turning the tide in his favor. The magical energies required for this summoning manifested as concentric rings of golden light that expanded outward from his position, each ring inscribed with Daedric symbols that shifted between different alphabets and meanings. Pelinal recognized the existential threat this summoning represented. Rather than continuing his direct assault, he employed a counter-ritual that witnesses later described as speaking words that bent the air. These utterances, delivered in a language that hurt the ears of those who heard it, created interference patterns in Eumeral's summoning rings, causing them to intersect in ways that destabilized the entire working. The resulting magical backlash staggered Eumeral, creating the opening Pelinal needed for his final attack. With a combination of precision and overwhelming force, he drove his sword through a specific point in Eumeral's armor where the chest plate joined the shoulder harness. This strike, delivered with such power that it created a visible distortion in the air around the blade, penetrated both the armor and Eumeral's physical form. The wound proved mortal to Eumeral's physical manifestation. Golden light erupted from the injury, accompanied by a high-pitched keening that caused pain to all who heard it. His physical form began to lose cohesion, the edges of his being becoming indistinct as his connection to Mundus weakened. In these final moments, however, Eumeral revealed the true nature of his Daedric heritage. As his physical form collapsed, Eumeral's essence separated from his body in a display of golden light that coalesced into a spectral shape resembling his corporeal form, but composed entirely of radiance. This spiritual manifestation briefly hovered before Pelinal, its features twisted in a combination of hatred and triumph. Then, in a burst of light that temporarily blinded all witnesses, this essence shot upward through the tower's apex, traveling along a predetermined path to Meridia's realm of oblivion. This departure represented not true death, but a strategic retreat. Eumeral's Daedric heritage and his pact with Meridia allowed his spirit to return to the colored rooms, where it would remain until conditions permitted his return to Mundus. This aspect of Daedric immortality, the ability to reconstitute a physical form after the destruction of a previous vessel, represented a metaphysical principle that Pelinal, for all his otherworldly knowledge, failed to fully comprehend. In the immediate aftermath of Eumeral's apparent defeat, Pelinal stood victorious but gravely wounded. The battle had taken a severe toll even on his extraordinary constitution. His armor, previously capable of self-repair, now showed permanent damage where Eumeral's light shards had penetrated its enchantments. Blood seeped from multiple injuries, and his movements lacked their usual fluid precision. Despite these injuries, Pelinal began a systematic destruction of the chamber's ritual features, using his sword to deface the inscriptions that maintain the tower's connection to Aeolid magical traditions. This act represented more than mere vandalism. It constituted a metaphysical reconfiguration of the tower itself, severing its ties to specific aspects of reality while preserving its fundamental role as a worldly stabilizer. What Pelinal failed to anticipate was the coordinated counterattack planned by the remaining Aeolid kings. While he had focused exclusively on Eumeral, 8 Aeolid sorcerer kings had gathered in a chamber directly below, performing a ritual that temporarily linked their magical abilities into a unified force. They had deliberately allowed Pelinal to reach Eumeral alone, knowing that the confrontation would leave him vulnerable regardless of its outcome. As Pelinal completed his destruction of the chamber's ritual features, these kings ascended through a previously concealed entrance. They entered not as individual combatants, but as components of a single magical working, each maintaining specific gestures and intonations that contributed to their shared power. Their coordination demonstrated the sophisticated magical traditions that had made the Aeolids formidable despite their political fragmentation. Weakened from his battle with Eumeral and caught in a moment of divided attention, Pelinal could not bring his full capabilities to bear against this new threat. The kings attacked not sequentially, but simultaneously, each contributing a different magical principle to create an overlapping field of destructive effects. Fire, frost, shock, and more esoteric energies converged on Pelinal from every direction at once, overwhelming even his armor's remarkable protective properties. Despite these overwhelming odds, Pelinal's final stand displayed the same martial brilliance that had characterized his entire campaign. With movements that belied his injuries, he managed to eliminate 3 of the kings in rapid succession, his sword cleaving through their magical protections with the same efficiency it had demonstrated throughout the rebellion. Each fallen king weakened the collective working, creating openings that Pelinal exploited with tactical precision. The remaining kings, recognizing the threat of individual engagement, adjusted their approach. Rather than maintaining their positions, they began a rotating formation that prevented Pelinal from isolating any single target. This coordinated movement, combined with their linked magical abilities, gradually wore down his defenses. Wounds accumulated across his body, his responses slowed incrementally, and the light emanating from his armor dimmed noticeably. The killing blow came not from magical assault, but from a more mundane weapon. As Pelinal focused on countering a particularly complex spell weaving, one of the kings managed to position himself in a blind spot. With a ceremonial spear reserved for ritual sacrifices, this king struck at a joint in Pelinal's armor that had been damaged during the fight with Eumeral. The spear penetrated completely, its enchanted tip disrupting the connection between Pelinal's physical form and whatever mysterious force animated his being. What followed was not a simple death, but a systematic dismemberment. The kings, recognizing the potential for Pelinal's posthumous influence, deliberately separated his body into 8 parts, each king claiming a portion. This division was not merely physical, but incorporated magical rituals designed to prevent any potential reconstitution. They scattered these remains throughout the tower, intending to perform more permanent disposal once the immediate crisis had passed. Only Pelinal's head remained intact, left in the chamber as a grim trophy of their victory. Yet even in this state, Pelinal defied conventional understanding of life and death. According to witnesses who entered the chamber later, his severed head continued to speak for several hours after separation from his body. These final utterances, recorded by Alessian scribes who reached the scene, contained both immediate tactical information and cryptic references to events centuries in the future. Among these statements was a clear warning about Eumeral's true nature. He is not ended. The unfeathered has only retreated beyond the doors of night, where his mother's light preserves him. He will return when the dragon fires fade and a new door opens between worlds. This prophetic warning, incomprehensible to its original audience, accurately described circumstances that would not occur until the Third Era's closing years, further evidence of Pelinal's connection to time itself. The recovery of Pelinal's remains became a priority for the Alessian forces once they secured the tower. Morihaus personally led the search, his grief manifesting as methodical determination. The kings had hidden the body parts well, incorporating deceptive enchantments that made them appear as architectural features or decorative elements. Despite these obstacles, all portions except the right hand were eventually recovered, a significant exception, as this was the hand that had wielded his legendary sword. The recovered remains displayed unusual properties that defied normal decomposition. The flesh remained uncorrupted, the blood retained its liquid state without coagulation, and the severed surfaces showed evidence of attempted regeneration that had been magically suppressed by Aeolid countermeasures. These characteristics supported theories about Pelinal's non-human nature, suggesting a physical form that operated according to principles different from conventional biology. Alessia ordered these remains placed in a specially constructed reliquary beneath what would later become the Temple of the One. The preservation rituals she established incorporated elements from multiple religious traditions, acknowledging the uncertain nature of Pelinal's being. These practices would eventually evolve into core ceremonies of the Alessian order, their original purpose gradually obscured by theological reinterpretation. The recovery and preservation of Pelinal's armor proved equally significant. Unlike conventional equipment, the armor maintained its structural integrity despite the damage sustained in the final battle. When assembled on a mannequin approximating Pelinal's proportions, witnesses reported that it occasionally emitted the same white light that had characterized it during his campaigns. Some accounts even claimed that faint sounds could be heard emanating from the empty helmet, whispers in an unknown language that caused unease in those who listened too closely. Following Pelinal Whitestake's death in the White Gold Tower, the nascent Alessian Empire faced the challenge of contextualizing his complex legacy. Alessia herself recognized the importance of properly memorializing the White Knight, understanding that his symbolic value to the liberation movement transcended his controversial methods. Within months of securing control of the imperial city, she established the first formal veneration practices centered around Pelinal's recovered remains. The initial ceremonies were intimate affairs restricted to veterans who had fought alongside him. These gatherings took place in a temporary shrine constructed near the base of White Gold Tower, where participants would place offerings of white flowers and polished weapons. Alessian records describe how Morihaus frequently visited this shrine alone during nightfall, sometimes remaining until dawn in silent contemplation. These early observances gradually formalized into the Night's Vigil, a tradition where warriors would stand guard over relics of Pelinal's armor throughout the night of the last seed full moon, marking the approximate anniversary of his final battle. As Alessia consolidated her rule, she incorporated Pelinal's veneration into the emerging imperial religious structure. The construction of the first Temple of the One included a specially designed lower chamber to house his remains. This reliquary featured architectural elements that deliberately echoed Pelinal's distinctive armor, white marble columns with silver inlay arranged in an octagonal pattern reminiscent of the star motif associated with him. The reliquary's location directly beneath the main altar established a physical connection between Pelinal's sacrifice and the worship of the divines, literally positioning him as the foundation upon which the new faith stood. The official theological position regarding Pelinal evolved significantly during the early Alessian period. Initial religious texts described him as the divine crusader, suggesting a direct connection to the gods without explicitly claiming he was divine himself. This careful positioning reflected Alessia's political acumen by elevating Pelinal to semi-divine status without full apotheosis. She created a figure that could be venerated by humans without directly challenging Edric worship. The College of Whispers has preserved fragments of Alessia's personal correspondence with her chief priest, Belharza, regarding Pelinal's religious status. In one notable letter she wrote, "The knight must be remembered as more than mortal but less than divine, a bridge between our realm and the higher spheres. His nature resists simple categorization, and so must our veneration of him." This nuanced approach characterized early imperial doctrine, which presented Pelinal as an agent of divine will rather than a god himself. By 1E 250, formal veneration practices had spread throughout the heartland. The most significant was the Festival of the Red Diamond, held annually on the 30th of Second Seed. This three-day celebration commemorated Pelinal's victories with military parades, athletic competitions, and ritualized reenactments of key battles. Participants would don white clothing and carry diamond-shaped red lanterns through city streets, symbolizing both Pelinal's armor and the red moments of his berserker rages, a theological reframing that transformed his controversial madness into sacred fury. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the rapid spread of Pelinal iconography throughout Cyrodiil. Excavations of First-era settlements consistently uncover household shrines featuring stylized representations of his distinctive armor. These small devotional objects, typically crafted from white clay with red paint details, suggest widespread popular veneration beyond official imperial ceremonies. The standardization of these icons across geographically distant sites indicates deliberate efforts by the early Alessian priesthood to promote a consistent visual language for Pelinal's cult. The theological complexity of Pelinal's position intensified with the rise of the Alessian order under the priest Maruk around 1 E361. Maruk's monotheistic reforms created doctrinal challenges regarding Pelinal's status. As the order increasingly emphasized the single deity they called the One, traditional veneration of lesser entities became problematic. Rather than diminishing Pelinal's importance, however, Maruk's followers recontextualized him as the perfect mortal vessel of divine will, an exemplar whose actions manifested the One's judgment against elven tyranny. This theological shift significantly altered veneration practices. The Festival of the Red Diamond was reformed into a more solemn observance called the Purification Remembrance, focusing less on military glory and more on Pelinal as an instrument of divine justice. Participants now engaged in ritual cleansing ceremonies and public confessions of impurity, conceptually linking their spiritual purification to Pelinal's purging of elven influence from Cyrodiil. This transformation reflected the Alessian order's increasingly anti-elven ideology, which retroactively justified Pelinal's most extreme actions. The Alessian order's control over Pelinal's legacy reached its apex during the so-called cleansing years of 1 E480–482, when High Priest Fervidius Tharn commissioned the standardized version of the Song of Pelinal that would become canonical. This edition systematically removed references to Pelinal's relationship with Morihaus, his prophetic utterances regarding future events, and the most graphic descriptions of his violence against non-combatants. The resulting text presented a sanitized Pelinal whose actions aligned perfectly with Alessian doctrine. Not all regions embraced the Alessian order's interpretation of Pelinal. In the Coluvian West, where traditional Nordic influences remained strong, local veneration practices preserved elements of the original cult. The Fighters Guild archives in Anvil contain records of the White Procession, a coastal ceremony where warriors would wade into the sea at dawn wearing white garments, symbolically reenacting legends of Pelinal's arrival from another shore. These regional variations maintained a more militaristic and less doctrinally rigid approach to his veneration. The construction of physical monuments to Pelinal accelerated during the late First Era, particularly under Emperor Ami-El, who sought to reinforce imperial legitimacy through association with the Alessian liberation. The most impressive of these structures was the Whitestake Basilica in Sancor Tor, featuring a massive white marble statue of Pelinal with his sword raised toward the east. The basilica's design incorporated astronomical alignments that caused sunlight to illuminate the statue's face only on the anniversary of the White Gold Tower's fall, demonstrating the sophisticated integration of Pelinal veneration into imperial architectural traditions. Archaeological investigations of these monuments reveal interesting patterns in how Pelinal was physically depicted across different eras. Early representations consistently show him in full armor with his face completely concealed by his helmet, emphasizing his mysterious, almost inhuman nature. By the mid-First Era, partial face reveals became common, humanizing him while maintaining an aura of otherness. Late First Era depictions often showed him bareheaded, but with eyes emitting light, a visual compromise between human and divine representation that aligned with evolving theological interpretations. The collapse of the Alessian order following the War of Righteousness created a vacuum in the official veneration of Pelinal. The subsequent rise of the Reman dynasty brought significant changes to his cult. Reman I, seeking to distinguish his rule from Alessian traditions while still claiming connection to Cyrodiil's liberation heritage, established new commemorative practices. The most significant was the Knights' Challenge, a tournament held every 4 years where warriors from throughout the Empire competed in events modeled after Pelinal's legendary feats. Winners received ceremonial white armor and the temporary title, Hand of Whitestake, serving as imperial champions until the next tournament. Reman-era theological texts reveal a subtle shift in Pelinal's religious positioning. Rather than emphasizing his role as an instrument of divine judgment, Riemann scholars presented him as a prototype of the dragon-born emperor, a mortal elevated by divine favor to accomplish extraordinary deeds. This interpretation created conceptual lineage connecting Alesia, Pelinal, and Riemann himself, reinforcing the new emperor's legitimacy. The temples of the divines constructed during this period typically included a small shrine to Pelinal adjacent to the main worship space, physically representing this theological relationship. The Second Empire's expansion brought Pelinal's veneration into contact with diverse cultural traditions, resulting in interesting syncretistic practices. In Hammerfell, where the Second Empire established significant presence, warrior lodges incorporated elements of Pelinal veneration into their own traditions. The Ashaba, already outcasts for their willingness to fight the honored dead, adopted Pelinal as a patron figure who transcended traditional taboos in service to a greater purpose. Their annual White Sand Walk combined Redguard ancestor reverence with symbolic elements drawn from Pelinal's campaigns. In sharp contrast, Pelinal's legacy among elven populations remained predominantly negative. Altmari historical texts from the First Era refer to him as the White Abomination, or the Star-Made Slaughter, emphasizing his role in cultural destruction rather than human liberation. The discovery of the Jultime Codex in 3E435 revealed that surviving Aelid communities maintained secret observances commemorating victims of Pelinal's campaigns, including rituals designed to bind the mad spirit and prevent his potential return. Bosmer perspectives on Pelinal proved more complex. While acknowledging his role in their Aelid cousin's destruction, Wood Elf oral traditions also recognized his opposition to Daedric influences that many Aelids had embraced. The White Stranger appears in several Bosmer folktales as an ambiguous figure who eliminated corrupted elven settlements but spared those living in harmony with natural law. These stories likely represent a cultural reconciliation between historical facts and the Bosmer desire to distinguish their society from Aelid practices. The Interregnum period saw significant fragmentation in Pelinal veneration. Without imperial authority maintaining standardized practices, regional variations flourished. In eastern Cyrodiil, the Nibnese traditions emphasized Pelinal's connection to stars and celestial phenomena, incorporating elaborate astrology into their observances. Western Colovian practices focused more on martial aspects, with warrior brotherhoods claiming direct spiritual lineage from Pelinal's original companions. These regional cults sometimes developed competing narratives about specific aspects of his campaigns, leading to occasional theological conflicts. The most significant development during the Interregnum was the emergence of the Knights of the White Stallion in the Blackwood region. This military order claimed to possess Pelinal's right gauntlet, the one part of his armor never recovered after his dismemberment. While historical evidence for this claim remains dubious, the order gained considerable influence by combining practical border defense with elaborate veneration ceremonies centered around this relic. Their fortress monastery became an important pilgrimage site, drawing visitors from throughout Cyrodiil to view the gauntlet and participate in dawn ceremonies, where it would allegedly emit light similar to descriptions of Pelinal's armor. The restoration of imperial authority under Tiber Septim brought renewed official attention to Pelinal's cult. The Third Empire approached his veneration with characteristic pragmatism, incorporating elements from various regional traditions while emphasizing aspects that reinforced imperial unity. The Office of Imperial Commerce even standardized the production of Pelinal devotional items, issuing quality guidelines for everything from household shrines to ceremonial weapons bearing his insignia. Third-era theological texts show interesting evolution in how the Eight Divines priesthood interpreted Pelinal. Rather than presenting him as an instrument of a single deity, official doctrine now positioned him as exemplifying different virtues associated with multiple divines. Akatosh's sense of order, Stendarr's mercy toward the oppressed, Zenithar's dedication to righteous labor, and Talos's martial prowess. This distributed theological approach reflected the more inclusive religious policies of the Septim dynasty, compared to the monotheistic tendencies of the Alessian order. The most elaborate imperial ceremony honoring Pelinal, developed during the early Third Era, was the septennial recitation, a complete public reading of the approved version of the Song of Pelinal, performed by priests from each divine's temple working in rotation. This event, lasting 3 full days, took place in the imperial city's temple district, with the emperor traditionally attending the opening and closing segments. The ceremony explicitly connected Pelinal's campaigns to the continuing imperial mission, presenting the empire as the fulfillment of his struggle against tyranny. The Oblivion Crisis of 3E433 precipitated a significant resurgence in Pelinal veneration, particularly after the emergence of a figure claiming to be a new divine crusader. This individual, whose identity remains disputed in historical records, allegedly recovered Pelinal's original relics and used them to defeat Eumeril the Unfeathered, who had indeed returned, just as Pelinal had prophesied centuries earlier. Whether this represented genuine divine intervention or elaborate political theater remains debated among scholars, but the effect on popular veneration was profound. In the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis, pilgrimages to sites associated with Pelinal increased dramatically. The Chapel of Dibella in Anvil, where the new divine crusader reportedly received visions, became particularly significant. Worshippers would leave offerings of white flowers and small weapons, reviving practices not seen since the early First Era. The Knights of the Nine, a reconstituted order claiming connection to both Pelinal and the new crusader, established chapters throughout Cyrodiil dedicated to maintaining these sites and performing regular ceremonies honoring both figures. The Fourth Era brought new challenges to Pelinal's veneration. The White Gold Concordat's restrictions on Talos worship created theological complications, as imperial doctrine had increasingly linked Pelinal and Talos as divine champions of humanity. Many underground Talos worshippers incorporated elements of Pelinal veneration into their hidden ceremonies, using his less controversial status as cover for prohibited practices. The Thalmor, recognizing this pattern, occasionally targeted prominent Pelinal shrines for investigation, claiming they were searching for hidden Talos worship while simultaneously suppressing veneration of another human champion. Despite these challenges, Pelinal's legacy remains deeply embedded in Cyrodiilic culture. Annual observances continue in most major cities, particularly the mid-year procession in the Imperial City, where participants carry white banners from the Temple of the One to the base of White Gold Tower. Academic institutions maintain dedicated Pelinal studies departments, though their focus has shifted from hagiography to more critical historical analysis. The University of Gwyllim's extensive collection of regional Pelinal veneration practices represents the most comprehensive documentation of how his legacy continues to evolve across different cultural contexts. The prophecies regarding Pelinal Whitestrake's return remained largely forgotten by the common folk of Tamriel until the waning years of the Third Era. Ancient texts preserved in the Imperial Library contained cryptic references to the White Knight's own final words, spoken through his severed head. "I shall return when the dragon fires fade and the barriers between worlds grow thin." These words, dismissed by many scholars as the delirious ramblings of a dying man, took on new significance as the Oblivion Crisis loomed on the horizon. The first signs of Pelinal's prophesied return manifested in 3E433, when reports emerged of strange dreams affecting citizens throughout Cyrodiil. These visions commonly featured a knight in gleaming white armor standing atop a hill, silently gesturing toward a distant shrine. The imperial cult initially attributed these dreams to anxiety over Emperor Uriel Septim VII's recent assassination, but the consistency of the imagery across diverse populations suggested something more significant was occurring. Synod researchers later determined that these dreams intensified in frequency and clarity as the barriers between Mundus and Oblivion weakened. The dreams appeared to concentrate around individuals with martial backgrounds. Guards, soldiers, and adventurers reported the visions with greater frequency than merchants or scholars. This pattern aligned with historical accounts of how Pelinal had recruited fighters during the original Alessian rebellion, suggesting a deliberate selection process rather than random spiritual phenomena. The most vivid of these dreams included specific directions to the Priory of the Nine, a long-abandoned monastery in the West Weald of Cyrodiil. This remote location had once housed an order of knights dedicated to the Nine Divines, with particular emphasis on Pelinal's legacy. The order had dissolved during the War of the Red Diamond in the Second Era, and the priory itself had fallen into obscurity, omitted from most contemporary maps. Its sudden reappearance in collective consciousness represented the first tangible evidence of Pelinal's influence reaching across the centuries. When the first dream-guided pilgrims arrived at the priory in late 3E 433, they discovered the building in remarkable condition despite centuries of abandonment. The stone structure showed minimal weathering, and the interior spaces remained largely intact, though covered in dust and cobwebs. Most significant was the undisturbed basement chamber, containing a circular table with 8 chairs and a 9th, larger chair positioned prominently at the head. This arrangement corresponded exactly to descriptions in rare texts about the original Knights of the Nine, an order founded shortly after Pelinal's death to honor his memory and continue his work. The centerpiece of this chamber was a map of Cyrodiil with 8 locations marked in faded ink, each corresponding to a shrine dedicated to one of the divines. According to the priory's surviving records, these shrines had once housed the 8 pieces of the Crusaders' relics, Pelinal's legendary armor and weapons, which had been distributed for safekeeping after his death. This discovery provided the first concrete link between the prophetic dreams and the physical legacy of Pelinal Whitestake. As Mehrunes Dagon's influence spread across Tamriel and Oblivion Gates began appearing throughout Cyrodiil, the significance of these relics took on new urgency. Historical accounts had consistently described Pelinal's equipment as particularly effective against Daedric entities. The mythic Dawn's assassination of Emperor Uriel Septim VII and his legitimate heirs had extinguished the dragonfires that maintained the barriers between worlds, precisely the condition Pelinal had specified for his return. The recovery of the Crusaders' relics began when an individual known to history only as the Divine Crusader heeded these prophetic dreams. Contemporary accounts describe this figure as unremarkable in appearance, but possessed of exceptional determination. The Divine Crusader's identity remains one of the Third Era's most debated historical questions, with theories ranging from a distant Septim relative to a direct spiritual incarnation of Pelinal himself. What records confirm is that this individual undertook a pilgrimage to each of the divine shrines, beginning with the Shrine of Dibella near Anvil. At each shrine, the Divine Crusader faced trials specifically designed to test qualities associated with the respective divine. These trials revealed much about Pelinal's own values, as interpreted by the original Knights of the Nine. At the Shrine of Dibella, the test involved perceiving beauty in unexpected places, a curious challenge for one associated with Pelinal, whose historical accounts rarely mentioned aesthetic appreciation. This suggests that the original Knights had recognized dimensions to Pelinal's character absent from popular narratives focused solely on his martial prowess. The Shrine of Arche presented a trial of life and death, requiring the Divine Crusader to protect the living while honoring the dead. This reflected Pelinal's complex relationship with mortality, a warrior who brought death yet fought to preserve life for the enslaved. The trial at Zenithar's shrine tested craftsmanship and honest labor, qualities that historical accounts attributed to Pelinal during the periods between battles when he taught former slaves practical skills for self-sufficiency. Each successful trial revealed the location of one piece of the Crusader's relics. The recovery of the Helm of the Crusader from Kynareth's shrine proved particularly significant. Witnesses described how the Divine Crusader approached the helm only to be surrounded by a swirling wind that coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape. This manifestation reportedly spoke with a voice, like thunder heard across centuries, delivering a message that many scholars interpret as Pelinal's direct guidance. The enemy of old returns through doors thought sealed. What was sundered must be made whole again. The recovered relics displayed properties consistent with historical descriptions of Pelinal's original equipment. The cuirass of the Crusader exhibited the same self-repairing capabilities mentioned in First-Era accounts. The sword of the Crusader emitted a faint white light that intensified in the presence of Daedric entities. Most tellingly, when the Divine Crusader assembled the complete set, witnesses reported seeing a ghostly aura surrounding the wearer, a luminous outline resembling Pelinal's form as depicted in ancient frescoes. As the Divine Crusader gathered the relics, evidence of Umeral the Unfeathered's return became increasingly apparent. Imperial battle mages reported unusual magical disturbances centered around Aelid ruins, particularly those historically associated with worship of Meridia. Explorers who ventured into these ruins encountered Aurorans, the same Daedric servants of Meridia that had protected Umeral during the Alessian Rebellion. These golden-armored entities exhibited powers specifically effective against followers of the Nine Divines, suggesting a deliberate counterforce to the emerging Crusader. The theological implications of Umeral's return proved as significant as its practical dangers. His reappearance validated Pelinal's final prophecy, confirming that the half-Daedric Aelid king had indeed preserved his essence in Meridia's realm of oblivion rather than experiencing true death. This revelation forced imperial theologians to reconsider conventional understandings of mortality and divine intervention. If Umeral could return after millennia through his Daedric connection, what did this suggest about Pelinal's own nature and his prophesied return? The answer emerged through the Divine Crusader's experiences while wearing the assembled relics. Multiple witnesses reported instances where the Crusader appeared to act with knowledge impossible for any contemporary mortal to possess. During an encounter with Aurorans at Fort Bulwark, the Crusader reportedly identified a hidden weakness in their formation that corresponded exactly to a tactical vulnerability Pelinal had exploited during the Battle of Seatatar, a detail preserved only in obscure First-Era texts not available to the public. More compelling evidence of Pelinal's direct influence came during the Divine Crusader's prayer vigils at the Great Chapel of Talos in Bruma. Attendants observed the Crusader speaking in an archaic dialect of Cyrodiilic consistent with First-Era linguistic patterns. These utterances, recorded by chapel scholars, included references to individuals and events from Pelinal's original campaign that had been omitted from standard historical accounts, but were later verified through archaeological evidence. This suggested not merely inspiration, but a direct connection to Pelinal's consciousness or memories. The culmination of these experiences occurred at the Priory of the Nine, where the Divine Crusader established a restored knightly order to continue Pelinal's legacy. During the induction ceremony for new knights, multiple witnesses reported a manifestation they described as Pelinal's blessing, a column of white light that descended from the ceiling to engulf each initiate. Those who experienced this phenomenon reported hearing a voice delivering the same oath Pelinal had administered to his original followers. "By my hand and will, the darkness shall break upon the stones of light." With the reconstituted Knights of the Nine at their side, the Divine Crusader prepared for direct confrontation with Umeral. Historical records indicate that the Aurorans had begun systematic attacks on chapels throughout Cyrodiil, desecrating altars and killing priests in a campaign reminiscent of the religious persecution practiced by Daedruphile Aelids. These attacks followed a pattern that magical scholars identified as a ritual working, designed to weaken the metaphysical influence of the Divines in preparation for Umeral's full manifestation on Mundus. The Divine Crusader's counter-strategy revealed further evidence of Pelinal's guidance. Rather than defending individual chapels reactively, the Crusader led the knights in consecrating specific sites corresponding to locations where Pelinal had achieved major victories during the Alessian Rebellion. This created a network of warded locations that disrupted Umeral's ritual working while simultaneously strengthening the Crusader's connection to Pelinal's original campaign. The magical theory underlying this approach incorporated principles of sympathetic resonance that exceeded contemporary understanding, suggesting access to knowledge from an earlier era. The final confrontation with Umeral occurred in two distinct phases that mirrored Pelinal's original duel. The first battle took place in the physical realm, at the ancient Aelid settlement of Garlas Malader on the Gold Coast, a site historically associated with Meridia worship that had remained largely unexplored since the First Era. Archaeological evidence recovered after the battle confirmed that Eumeril had established a physical anchor point there, creating a conduit between Mundus and the colored rooms that allowed his reconstituted form to manifest. Witnesses described Eumeril's physical appearance as virtually identical to ancient depictions, a towering figure in golden white armor with crystalline wing structures extending from his shoulders. This perfect preservation across millennia further confirmed his nature as something beyond conventional mortality. Most significantly, he displayed the same half-Daedric abilities that had challenged Pelinal originally, including manipulation of light as a weapon and partial existence in multiple planes simultaneously. The Divine Crusaders' battle with this manifestation demonstrated tactics strikingly similar to those attributed to Pelinal in historical accounts. Rather than attempting to counter Eumeril's light-based attacks directly, the Crusader repeatedly closed distance to engage in close combat, where the Aelid king's ranged advantages were neutralized. The sword of the Crusader proved particularly effective against Eumeril's armor, creating the same disruption in its magical properties that ancient texts had described during Pelinal's original duel. When Eumeril's physical form finally fell, witnesses observed the same phenomenon reported during his first defeat, his essence separating from his body as a golden spectral entity preparing to retreat to Meridia's realm. Here occurred the crucial difference from the original confrontation. Where Pelinal had lacked the means to pursue Eumeril beyond physical death, the Divine Crusader initiated what observers described as a divine translation, the Crusader's own spirit temporarily separating from their body to pursue Eumeril into the spiritual realm. This metaphysical pursuit represented the fulfillment of Pelinal's unfinished work. The knights who witnessed the event reported that both the Crusader's physical form and spectral manifestation briefly displayed the overlaid image of Pelinal himself, as though two entities occupied the same space across different points in time. This visual confirmation of Pelinal's direct involvement supported theological interpretations that the original White Knight had indeed returned, not through conventional reincarnation, but through spiritual guidance and partial possession of a worthy vessel. The battle in the spiritual realm remains largely undocumented, except through the Divine Crusader's own subsequent account. What magical censors did record was an unprecedented surge of energy at the site, combining elements associated with both Edric and Daedric forces. Magical theorists from the Arcane University, who studied these residual patterns, concluded that the Crusader had somehow channeled divine power from multiple sources simultaneously, a feat normally impossible due to the inherent opposition between different divine entities. When the Divine Crusader returned to physical consciousness, they brought definitive evidence of Eumeril's permanent defeat. The crystalline fragments recovered from the battlefield displayed a unique form of magical depletion consistent with complete severance from their Daedric source. Meridia's connection to Eumeril had been not merely disrupted, but fundamentally broken, preventing any future reconstitution of his essence. This complete victory accomplished what Pelinal had failed to achieve in his original confrontation, bringing genuine closure to a conflict that had spanned millennia. The theological implications of these events reverberated throughout imperial religious institutions. The proven return of Pelinal's influence, whether through direct spiritual manifestation or divine inspiration, challenged conventional understandings of the relationship between mortal champions and divine powers. If Pelinal could extend his influence across thousands of years to complete an unfinished task, what did this suggest about the nature of heroic figures throughout Tamrielic history? Were they truly gone after death, or did they persist in some form, continuing to shape events from beyond conventional mortality? In the aftermath of Eumeril's defeat, the reconstituted knights of the 9 established permanent shrines at locations associated with both Pelinal's original campaign and the Divine Crusader's modern quest. These sites became popular pilgrimage destinations, particularly for warriors seeking blessing before battle. The most significant of these shrines, located at the Priory of the Nine, displayed an unusual phenomenon. Visitors consistently reported hearing faint metallic sounds like armor shifting when no one was present, and occasionally glimpsing a white armored figure watching from peripheral vision. The Crusaders' relics themselves remained with the Knights of the Nine through the remainder of the Third Era, their powers apparently diminished after Umaral's defeat but still formidable. Magical analysis of the artifacts revealed that they existed in a state of temporal complexity, simultaneously being both ancient objects from the First Era and more recent reconstructions, as though Pelinal's original equipment had been recreated through divine intervention rather than simply preserved. This paradoxical condition further supported theories about Pelinal's unique relationship to time itself. As the Third Era gave way to the Fourth and the Septim Dynasty ended, the Knights of the Nine gradually diminished in prominence. The onset of the Great War and subsequent White Gold Concordat created political complications for an order so closely associated with the banned worship of Talos, yet Pelinal's legacy endured through less formal channels. Warriors throughout Cyrodiil continued to place white flowers at sites associated with his campaigns, and small household shrines bearing his image remained common in rural areas. The most lasting impact of Pelinal's Third Era return was not physical but spiritual, a confirmation that the boundaries between historical epochs remained permeable to those of sufficient divine significance. His fulfillment of a prophecy spoken at the moment of his dismemberment demonstrated that certain figures transcend conventional mortality, existing in a state of potential rather than absolute absence. For the people of Tamriel, this knowledge provided reassurance that their greatest champions might return in times of greatest need, that what appears to be death may simply be a temporary withdrawal until the proper moment for return. In this way, Pelinal Whitestrake's legacy extends beyond his historical accomplishments to embody a fundamental truth about Tamriel itself, that the past is never truly finished, and that those who shape history most profoundly may continue to influence it long after their apparent departure from the mortal realm.